Season 2 opens up with Grace came to meet Thomas Shelby to say goodbye. Grace was waiting for Thomas because she wanted Thomas to go with her, but instead, Chester was the one who came. He pointed a gun at her. Unexpectedly, Grace had prepared a gun inside of her bag. She managed to protect herself by shooting Chester with that gun. 2 years later, the street gang Peaky Blinders had achieved more popularity and success. Because of their success, the number of their enemies and rivals increased. On the funeral day of Freddie Thorne, one of the pubs that was owned Peaky Blinders was attacked by an unknown party. There was no victim in that incident, but Peaky Blinders lost quite a lot of money because of that incident. Because Peaky Blinders had a reputation as an extremely dangerous organization, Ada Shelby decided to leave the Shelby family. She didn't want to put herself and her son in danger, especially after the death of Freddie, a person who had protected her all this time. After Thomas returned from the funeral, he came to the Garrison pub to look for any clue about the person who had destroyed the pub. After he investigated it for a while, he and Aunt Polly found a clue which implied that the culprit was a group of Irish people called the Black Lion. After Thomas found the clue, he went straight to meet the leader of that group. Thomas met the leader of the Black Lion called Irene O'Donnell and one of Irene's subordinates. Thomas asked Irene whether the Black Lion was the one who had blown up his pub or not. Instead of answering Thomas's question, Irene was insulting him. Thomas was mad because of that, so he mentioned about the internal problems that were being faced by Irish people. Thomas told Irene that he knew everything about Irene. It meant that he had researched everything about Irene's background before their meeting took place. This was how Thomas Shelby scared his enemies without needing to use violence. Because of this, Irene was a little moved by Thomas, so she decided not to kill him. She told Thomas to do everything that she ordered him instead. After Thomas came out of Irene's room, he became very angry. He felt like he had been humiliated and mocked by the leader of the Black Lion. At night, Thomas came to meet a police chief to bribe him into freeing the territory from the policemen until 4 a.m. The police chief gave free additional information to Thomas. He told him that Chester had been promoted as the chief of the Irish Secret Intelligence Agency. He also told him that he planned to visit Chester's territory. Apparently, Chester was still alive. He only suffered from a serious leg injury. At the Shelby family's base, Thomas and other members of Peaky Blinders were talking about their business expansion plan to London. At first, John's wife, Esme, disagreed with the plan because she thought that the business expansion to London was very dangerous. Based on the information that she had received, there were many gang wars in London. The police and the foreign people often got involved in those gang wars. She worried that her children would lose their father because of the business expansion that they were planning to do. Apparently, Thomas had considered and calculated everything that might happen, so he ignored Esme's opinion. He told them that their business expansion plan to London was going to be executed soon. They would begin to expand their business to London at tomorrow morning on the day of Newmarket. On that day, all bosses would come to the horse racing venue. Thomas also planned to take advantages of the gang war between the Jewish gang and the Irish gang in order to get more allies. It seemed like he was interested with the Jewish gang. If their business expansion succeeded, it could be guaranteed that Peaky Blinders would take control of the territories in London. Apparently, Thomas had found out about the person who destroyed the Garrison pub. He came to meet that person and shot him to death. As soon as Thomas, John, and Arthur arrived in London, the three of them visited a pub that was owned by the Sabini family. Unfortunately, Thomas and his two brothers were rejected by the Sabini family there because they came from a different territory. Because of that, they finally got into a fight. Thomas was disappointed because the result of their visit wasn't like what he had expected. He expected that by visiting that place, Peaky Blinders would have a new ally and not a new enemy, but instead, they were rejected by the Sabini family. It meant that the Sabini family had declared a war against Peaky Blinders. At the same time, Chester asked his boss to allow him to work together with Thomas Shelby. He promised to kill Thomas once their business had finished. Not long after that, the members of the Sabini gang began to make a move. They kidnapped Ada and ganged up on Thomas and beat him up. Fortunately, when Thomas was about to get murdered by them, Chester and his subordinates came and saved Thomas. The members of Peaky Blinders also managed to save Ada. After Thomas woke up, Chester discussed about their plan to work together. He told Thomas that he would punish him for the murder that he committed a few days ago if Thomas refused his offer. After that, Thomas decided to sail to London for 4 days. Even though he hadn't fully recovered, he decided to leave soon because he was afraid if the Sabini gang would come back to attack him. As soon as Thomas arrived in London, he went to Camden Town to meet the leader of the Jewish gang called Alfie Solomons. He asked him to become his ally and promised that he would give 100 armed men and the contacts with the policemen to him. After Solomons heard that, he accepted Thomas's offer immediately. After the meeting was over, Thomas came to meet Ada, who was currently living in London. he gave Ada a luxurious house which was located far from the dominion of the Sabini family. At the Sabini family's base, Sabini paid and ordered a policeman to catch Thomas because according to his informant, Thomas had visited the base of the Solomon's gang. After the policeman left the room, Sabini also ordered his subordinate to target the Shelby family because he had secretly lost faith in police. At the same time, Thomas celebrated the birthday of Aunt Polly. He gave her a mansion as a birthday present. Thomas also said that he planned to look for Aunt Polly's children who had been missing since a long time ago. Based on the information that he collected from police records, he finally managed to find out about the whereabouts of one of Aunt Polly's children. He went to Jansen family's residence. Jansen's family had adopted children since a long time ago. Thomas told Mrs. Jansen that the biological mother of Henry was missing her son. Mrs. Jansen became angry after she heard that. Then, she told Thomas to go. Before Thomas left, he told Henry that Henry's real name was actually Michael Gray. He also gave the address of Aunt Polly to him. After that, Thomas came to meet Aunt Polly. He told her that he had found out that Aunt Polly's daughter had died. Meanwhile, his son called Michael Gray was still alive. After Aunt Polly heard that, she urged Thomas to tell her about the current address of Michael Gray. But Thomas refused to tell Aunt Polly because he knew that Michael's foster mother wouldn't allow them to take her son. Thomas said that they needed to wait until Thomas turned at least 18 because Thomas would be allowed to choose with whom he wanted to live by then. Unfortunately, Aunt Polly was missing her son and wanting to meet him soon, so she pointed a gun to Thomas. She forced Thomas to tell her about the current address of Michael Gray. Thomas stayed calm even though he was being threatened because he knew that Aunt Polly wouldn't dare to do anything harmful to him. Eventually, Aunt Polly decided to leave to calm herself. At night, Thomas asked Lizzie, his new secretary, to send a letter to the Secretary of State Churchill. In that letter, Thomas stated that he was disappointed with what Chester had done to him. As a former outstanding soldier in World War I who had been awarded for his honorable service, Thomas expected that Chester could have been kinder to him, especially after what he had sacrificed and done to their country. Because of that, Thomas asked the Secretary of State Churchill to allow him to export some goods to various countries in the world such as India, the Malay Peninsula, Canada, and Russia. Thomas planned to move certain processed goods from Birmingham to Poplar Dock. The Secretary of State Churchill thought that Thomas didn't ask for much, so he planned to allow Thomas to do what he asked. Chester didn't want to give up easily, so he asked the police chief who had been bribed by Thomas to betray Thomas. The next evening, the Garrison pub had finally finished of being repaired. Thomas invited all members of Peaky Blinders to come and have a party there. That night, Arthur actually didn't want to come to the party because he was ashamed of himself after he murdered someone in a battlefield. But Finn suddenly came and persuaded his brother to come. He also gave a drug to Arthur to make him feel better. In the middle of the crowd at the party, Thomas suddenly felt lonely because he was missing Grace. Unfortunately, he had to forget his love story with Grace because he had been informed that Grace had gotten married to another man and enjoyed her new life. When the drunken Aunt Polly arrived at her house, she was surprised to see a boy standing in front of her house. That boy told him that he was looking for his biological mother who resided in that address. Not long after that, Thomas, John, and Arthur visited Aunt Polly's house and met Michael. After they had been separated for a long time, they finally found each other. They introduced themselves to each other. Thomas worried because Michael hadn't turned 18 yet, so he asked Michael to go back to his foster parents' house, but Michael refused to go because he thought that it was better if he stayed there. The next day, Thomas hired some men and turned them into prisoners to fulfill the quota of the prison sentence. One of the men that he hired was a geeky-looking man. After that, Thomas met a former war veteran called Billy. He chose Billy to be the leader of the 100 armed men who would help the Jewish gang in the gang war. At the Sabini family's base, Sabini received information that they were still unable to kill both the leader of the Jewish gang and the members of Peaky Blinders. He also received information that one of their members was getting arrested. Apparently, the member that they were talking about was the geeky-looking man who had been hired by Thomas. He ordered his subordinate to kill that member so Thomas Shelby would see how dangerous and cruel the Sabini gang was. At night, two Sabini's subordinates killed the geeky-looking man like how they were ordered. All members of Peaky Blinders were shocked when they heard about that incident. Then, Thomas ordered one of his subordinates to go to the prison to find out about who was the murderer in that incident. After that, Thomas attended a horse auction because he wanted to approach the high society of the horse racing. He planned to use them to defeat the Sabini gang. In that horse auction, Thomas met a woman who seemed attracted to him. That woman was a widow who was a member of the high society called May Carlton. When Thomas and other members of the Shelby family were about to leave that place, suddenly they got attacked by the members of the Sabini gang. Arthur went out of control. He beat up a member of the Sabini gang violently. The next day, Thomas had a meeting with Chester, Irene, and her assistant. When Thomas saw that Chester and the Black Lion were close to each other, he believed that Chester and the Black Lion had conspired against him to blow up the Garrison pub. During that meeting, Irene ordered Thomas to kill someone. After Thomas heard that, he decided to leave that room immediately. Outside of that room, Chester tried to threaten Thomas with the export permit which had been approved by the Secretary of State Churchill. Thomas told Chester that he actually agreed to work together with him, but because Irene's subordinate who was sitting together with them in that room was apparently a secret agent, Thomas wanted Chester to kill that secret agent first. After that, he would agree to work together with Chester. In Camden Town, Arthur and 100 armed men who had been prepared by Thomas attacked a pub that was owned by the Sabini family. They killed all members of the Sabini gang at that pub and announced that Peaky Blinders had taken control of that pub. At home, Michael told Thomas that he wanted to become a business accountant who worked for Peaky Blinders. Thomas rejected his request instantly because he didn't want to put Michael in danger. The next day, May Carlton visited a gambling house which was owned by the Shelby family. She came there because she wanted to meet Thomas. Esme, who saw May at the gambling house, asked May about who she was and what was her purpose to visit that place. May told her that she was a horse trainer who would become a trainer for Thomas's horse soon. Not long after that, Thomas came and asked May to check on his horse. Thomas told May that he wanted his horse to win in the competition. Before May left that place, she asked Thomas about the name of his horse. Thomas said that the name of his horse was Grace's Secret. At night, Thomas and Aunt Polly got into an argument. They argued about Michael, who wanted to become a business accountant who worked for the Shelby family. Thomas wanted to know about Aunt Polly's opinion about this matter. Apparently, Aunt Polly agreed if her son became a business accountant for the Shelby family. Thomas promised that he would assign Michael some legal accounting jobs so Michael wouldn't have any problem with the law. Thomas and Aunt Polly were satisfied and happy with their agreement. After that, they was holding a party to celebrate Michael's 18th birthday and to welcome Michael for joining the business of the Shelby family. In a meeting, Thomas told everyone that he planned to smuggle various kinds of alcohols into several territories. He planned to send those alcohols with car spare parts. Even though it was actually an illegal activity, Thomas and other members of the Shelby family didn't have to worry because they already had an export permit which was approved by the government. Because Thomas would do an extremely dangerous mission soon, he gave his testament to Ada. Ada was mad at Thomas when she found out about Thomas's illegal business. Apparently, Thomas had created a deposit account for the son of Ada Shelby. He did this because he really cared about his only sister. At the same time, Sabini came to meet the Jewish gang who had been siding with Peaky Blinders. Sabini persuaded Alfie Solomons to betray Thomas. Eventually, they had made an agreement. At night, Michael's friend asked Michael to go to a pub with him. Michael's friend was a black person. He asked Michael to go to the pub because Michael was a member of Peaky Blinders. This would benefit him since the members of Peaky Blinders were highly respected by people. Unfortunately, when they were having fun at that pub, a man approached Michael's friend and told him to leave that pub because he was a black person. Michael didn't like how that man treated his friend, so he beat up that man immediately to defend his friend. The pub owner finally broke up their fight after he said that Michael was a relative of Thomas Shelby. After that man heard that, he apologized to them immediately. He said that he wasn't aware about that fact. Michael had forgiven the man who had attacked him, but not with Arthur and John. They brought a group of people with them to the pub to kill the pub owner and burn the pub. This was how Peaky Blinders showed the world that they wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who had disrespected their members. At a church, Chester reminded Thomas about the mission that he would do soon. When Thomas heard that, he told Chester that if he died when he was doing that mission, then Chester wouldn't be able to see the world anymore too. When Thomas arrived at home, he called a hotel in New York on telephone, but when he heard a man answering his call, he ended that call immediately. Apparently, the man who answered his call was Grace's husband. Even though he hadn't talked to Grace for a long time, he managed to find out about Grace's current address. At the same time, Arthur, Billy, and some of his subordinates were having a meeting with the leader of the Jewish gang to discuss about their agreement. In the middle of their meeting, the Jewish gang suddenly attacked Arthur and shot Billy to death. This incident happened because the Jewish gang had decided to side with the Sabini gang. After that, the Jewish gang caught Arthur and Michael at Aunt Polly's house. Thomas was busy taking care of his horse at May's house. He didn't receive any information about what had happened to his family. He didn't expect that the Jewish gang and Chester would betray their agreements. After Thomas found out about what had happened, Thomas came to meet Chester and leashed out his anger at him. Chester said that he had planned to ruin Thomas's life since the beginning. He had never agreed to work together with Thomas, let alone to help him. It was about time before Peaky Blinders was destroyed completely. In that chaos situation, Grace suddenly called Thomas on telephone and asked him to meet her. Thomas refused to meet her because he was dealing with many problems that were more important than their meeting. Grace understood him. She said that she would wait for him to call her again. At the Shelby family's base, Thomas received information about his subordinates who were getting caught. He also received information that some warehouses and businesses that were owned by the Shelby family were being confiscated by the government. They were having a discussion to find solutions to all of these problems except Aunt Polly, who was worrying about his son. Aunt Polly didn't care anymore about Peaky Blinders because Michael was more important to her. After Esme heard that, she suggested to ask the Lee family to help them solve their problems. Thomas agreed with her immediately. The next day, Aunt Polly came to meet Chester and begged him to release Michael. Because of that, Aunt Polly finally managed to reunite with Michael. After Michael had been released, Aunt Polly was determined to keep Michael away from Peaky Blinders and everything that was related to them. At her house, Grace was dressing up beautifully before she came to meet Thomas. She told her husband that she would go to London to visit her aunt. As she arrived in London, she was spending a very long evening with Thomas by reminiscing about many things together. Thomas told Chester about what he was doing with Grace to take revenge on him by making him mad. The next day, Thomas ordered John to blow up the door of the Field Marshal Russell's house. Apparently, it was only a beginning because the real murder would take place in a horse racing. Before Thomas did that dangerous mission, he was writing a letter. He explained about his situation in which he was ordered by the kingdom to commit mass murder. He also mentioned Chester's name in that letter and explained that Chester was the person who planned about that horrible mass murder. Then, Thomas gave the letter to Ada Shelby and asked her to send it to the editors of New York Times if Thomas didn't return from his mission. After that, Thomas and a young man called James went to the base of the Jewish gang to meet the leader of the Jewish gang called Solomon's. When they arrived there, Thomas seemed to hide something there, but he pretended like he was tying his shoes. Thomas came to meet Solomon's because he wanted to offer to work together with him. At first, Solomon's was only playing around with Thomas by asking profit margin of 100%, but then, Thomas got the upper hand of the situation by telling Solomon's that he had planted a bomb at that place. If Solomon's refused his offer, then he would blow up that place into pieces. Solomon's was afraid when he heard about that, so he finally agreed to work together with Thomas. At the same time, Chester came to see 3 hitmen whom he had hired to kill Thomas Shelby. Meanwhile, at another place, Thomas gathered all members of Peaky Blinders including Arthur, who apparently had been released. He told them about the plan that they would execute soon at the horse racing venue. He said that right at 3 p.m., he would run a strategy that would distract all policemen at the horse racing venue. During that moment, Arthur and other members of Peaky Blinders should use the situation to destroy the business of the Sabini family. After that, all of them were heading to the horse racing venue. Before the horse racing began, Thomas was talking to May. It was obvious that May began to fall in love with Thomas because she said that she was willing to sacrifice and do everything to make Thomas's horse win. She also asked Thomas to meet her after the competition was over. Thomas still had no idea about what would happen to him, so he told May that no matter how the result of the competition, their relationship would still be alright. When Thomas was about to do his mission, Grace suddenly approached and stopped him. Grace told him that she was pregnant with his baby. Thomas was shocked when he heard about that, because it wasn't a right situation to have discussion about it. Thomas told Grace to tell her husband that she was pregnant with her husband's baby, but Grace refused because it was only Thomas whom she loved. After Thomas heard that, he asked Grace to wait until the horse racing was over. He said that he would tell her his decision by then. Thomas had asked Lizzie to seduce the Field Marshal Russell. When Lizzie and the Field Marshal Russell were spending time together in a room, Thomas came and killed the Field Marshal Russell immediately. Thomas came out of that room and told a policeman that the Field Marshal Russell had been murdered by someone. Because of that incident, all policemen secured the horse racing venue immediately. Arthur and other members of Peaky Blinders took advantage of that situation to do their mission. At that time, Thomas went straight to meet Sabini. Sabini wasn't guarded by the policemen because the policemen were busy protecting the king and securing the horse racing venue. Not long after that, Sabini realized that Thomas's subordinates had seized all of his businesses. He had lost all of his businesses this time. All of his business had been taken control by Peaky Blinders, who had been siding with Alfie Solomons again. Not long after that, 3 hitmen who had been hired by Chester came and caught Thomas. They were disguising themselves as policemen. Outside of the horse racing venue, 2 beautiful women who were falling in love with Thomas finally met each other. Both Grace and May provoked each other by bragging about themselves. May said that she was a member of high society, which meant that she would be very helpful for the businesses that were ran by Thomas and Peaky Blinders. Meanwhile, Grace said that Thomas really loved her despite she was only an ordinary woman. Thomas even named his horse as Grace's secret. In a telephone booth, Chester called his boss on telephone to make a report about the recent situation. Not long after that, Aunt Polly stepped inside of the same telephone booth and killed Chester immediately. When the horse racing competition was over, Arthur, John, and other members of Peaky Blinders were very satisfied and happy because of all benefits that had been received by Peaky Blinders, but they didn't realize that Thomas hadn't returned. Thomas was being brought by the 3 hitmen to his own grave. but when he was about to get murdered, one of the hitmen hit 2 of his colleagues.
Some the booze.
Smoke.
Oh, and there's a woman. Fucking everything!
Turned out, the Secretary of State Churchill had assigned him with different job. Because of that, Thomas managed to save himself from the death once again. All members of Peaky Blinders were celebrating their success. Meanwhile, in a room, Thomas told Michael that he might get married soon. 2 years had passed after Thomas almost got executed by the hitmen who were ordered by Chester. 2 years ago, Thomas Shelby said that he wanted to get married soon. Finally, the wedding day of Thomas and a woman whom he loved had come. The members of Peaky Blinders and the members of the bride's families who came from the group of cavalries gathered in a church to attend the wedding of Thomas and his bride. Not long after that, the bride who had been waited by everybody finally arrived in the church. Apparently, the beautiful woman who was lucky to be the wife of Thomas Shelby was Grace. The existence of Thomas and Grace's son called Charles had softened Thomas's heart that he decided to change his marital status. Thomas Shelby was known as a successful businessman back then. Because of his successful business, he could afford to live in a beautiful mansion. After Thomas and Grace exchanged their wedding vows, everybody in the church went to Thomas's mansion to enjoy the wedding party. At first, everything went well, but suddenly, Thomas Shelby faced an urgent situation. Even on his wedding day, Thomas still had many business problems that he needed to solve and some meetings that he needed to attend soon. On his wedding day, Thomas noticed some people who weren't invited as his guests came to his wedding ceremony and mingled with other invited guests there. After Thomas saw them, he told all members of Peaky Blinders to come to the kitchen. Thomas told them that it was his and Grace's glorious day, so he asked them not to make any scene on that day. If there was any problem, he told them to solve that problem as quietly as possible that nobody could ever notice. There was something different about Arthur this time. Arthur had married a beautiful woman called Linda. Because of Linda, Arthur slowly began to leave his dirty world. He had even become a better person who could control his anger. After that, everybody gathered in the dining room to have a dinner. There was a Russian gangster who joined the dinner. He approached Aunt Polly and talked to her. He asked Aunt Polly to help him talk to Thomas. After the Russian gangster met Thomas, Thomas asked the Russian gangster to give him all money that he had promised. The amount of that money was $10,000. The Russian gangster said that those money would be given by the niece of the Duke who would come from London. Grace suspected that something dangerous was happening there, so she asked Aunt Polly to confirm whether her suspicion was right or not. Aunt Polly told her that Russian people had bought some weapons that they would use to fight the Bolsheviks in Georgia, and Churchill was the middleman in that trade. Grace believed that it was what had been bothering Thomas's mind. After that, she asked Thomas to promise to leave his illegal businesses and live a normal life with his little family. Grace planned to establish a foundation. Meanwhile, she wanted Thomas to take care of horse tracks and car selling businesses. Grace wanted them to do that because she wanted to protect their son Charles. A couple of times later, the police chief Moss escorted a woman who came from London. That woman carried the money that would be given to Thomas. She was the niece of the Duke and she was called the Grand Duchess Tatiana Petrovna. When Thomas asked her to give the money to him, Tatiana said that she was told to give those money to Mr. Kaldin. Thomas suspected that Kaldin was a secret agent from the embassy of the Soviet Union, so he wanted Tatiana to give those money to him instead. After Thomas received the money, Arthur began to worry because Peaky Blinders had got involved in a very serious problem. Thomas told him that he had to do this because they had no other options except playing the Churchill's game. Since Arthur had committed to become a better person, he instantly refused Thomas's request when Thomas asked him to kill people again. But after Thomas forced him into doing it, Arthur finally had to face Kaldin. Arthur and Kaldin got into a fight before Arthur finally managed to kill Kaldin. Nobody could hear the noise that came from Arthur's gunshot because Thomas had prepared everything to silence it. He had made sure that the invited guests were busy having fun in his party so none of them would realize that a murder had happened there. The next day, Thomas and the members of Peaky Blinders went to the base of Peaky Blinders to store all money that they had received. After that, Thomas went to a car manufacturing plant to meet a foreman. Thomas and that foreman had a conversation. Thomas said that he wanted to keep the key to the room number 6. As Thomas had expected, he found many secret tanks in that room. After that, Thomas came to meet a highly influential priest who had strong influences on the military, the parliamentarians, and the police. He said that he would organize a meeting between Thomas and a parliamentarian called Patrick Jarvis. Apparently, there were 27 main battle tanks in the room that had been checked by Thomas before. Those main battle tanks would be used in the battles in Georgia. It seemed like Thomas didn't really agree with the game that they were playing. Before that priest left that place, he gave Thomas an identity of a person who would be met by Thomas at the Ritz Hotel. That person was the uncle of Tatiana. He was called the Grand Duke Leon Romanov. At the same time, John and Arthur came to meet a gang leader called Shangretta. The gang leader said that he couldn't accept what Peaky Blinders had done to them. Apparently, Peaky Blinders had burned their restaurant because the gang leader's son was interested in Lizzie. Because of that problem, Aunt Polly told John to apologize to Shangretta. but unfortunately, John refused to apologize to Shangretta and said that he preferred if they destroyed the Shangretta's gang instead. Not long after that, Thomas arrived at the Ritz Hotel. Mr. Romanoff was the person who had bought some weapons from Thomas, where Churchill played a role as the middleman for their trade. During that meeting, Mr. Romanoff gave Thomas a blue sapphire stone as a bonus for him. As Thomas arrived at the base of Peaky Blinders, he received information that John had attacked Shangretta. Surprisingly, Thomas was proud with what John had done to Shangretta. Unlike Aunt Polly and Arthur, who began to show their soft sides, Thomas hoped that John would always be a savage member of Peaky Blinders who would attack instead of apologize to their enemy. When Thomas arrived at home, he presented Grace with the blue sapphire stone to make Grace happy. Thomas thought that it would be nice if Grace wore that beautiful blue sapphire stone in an event that would be held soon by Shelby Institute. Shangretta was being hospitalized for his eye's severe injury after John attacked him. Because of this, Shangretta's father was furious. He planned to take revenge on Peaky Blinders. The next day, some policemen raided the base of Peaky Blinders and arrested John and Thomas. At the prison, the priest came to Thomas's prison cell to meet Thomas. He told Thomas that if Thomas wanted to be released, then Thomas must obey everything he said because he was a highly influential person who had strong influence on the police. He also warned Thomas to think carefully before he took any action if Thomas didn't want to put his wife and his son in danger. To prove that he was serious with his words, that priest said that he had put something inside of Charles's toy. After Thomas heard that, he returned to home soon and checked his son's bed. He found a name card under Charles's doll. The event of Shelby Institute was being held in the evening. That evening, Grace looked stunning with her beautiful dress and the blue sapphire necklace that was given by Thomas. Grace was proud and happy to hold that event. Her lifelong dream that Shelby family owned a charity foundation finally came true. But Thomas didn't share the same happiness with Grace, especially after he saw the priest and Patrick attending that event. Then, the three of them went to another room to have discussion. They talked about the main battle tanks. Patrick and the priest told Thomas to order Tatiana to check all of those main battle tanks. After Thomas returned to the party, he sensed that there was a danger around them. He tried to ask Grace to leave that party, but it was too late. Suddenly a man came out of the crowd and shot Grace to death. For days, Thomas was grieving the death of a woman he deeply loved and cared for. Because of this, his family was afraid to just say hi to him or to talk about their business. That day, Aunt Polly and Michael came to Thomas's room to make a report about their business. They didn't talk a lot about their business because Thomas was still highly affected by the death of his wife. After they came out of Thomas's room, they met Arthur and John, who also wanted to meet Thomas to make a report about something. Aunt Polly had warned them not to go to Thomas's room because she was afraid that Thomas would be angry. But Arthur and John didn't listen to her and insisted on going to Thomas's room. Arthur and John told Thomas that they had found and killed the person who killed Grace. Apparently, that person was ordered by Shangretta's father to kill Grace. Before Shangretta managed to run away to New York, Thomas told Arthur and John to kill him. He also told them to kill Shangretta's wife, who would come with him to New York. When John and Arthur heard that, they refused Thomas's request right away because Shangretta's wife was their school teacher. Thomas didn't care about that. He kept forcing John and Arthur to kill Shangretta and his wife. John said that he was disappointed with Thomas because he thought that Thomas was underestimating him and Arthur. He thought that Thomas only saw them as his subordinates whom he could order as he pleased to do all his dangerous and dirty work. He was jealous with Aunt Polly and Michael, who were treated better and given more decent work. Thomas said that he did this because Michael had been appointed as the person who was responsible for the legal or official work since the beginning, and during this difficult situation, Thomas only prioritized those legal businesses. The next day, Thomas left his mansion and took Charles with him. They were accompanied by one of Thomas's subordinates called Johnny Dogs. Thomas came to meet a fortune teller called Madame Boswell. He gave the blue sapphire stone to her. He wanted to find out if that blue sapphire stone was a cursed stone which caused his wife to be murdered, or it had nothing to do with the death of his wife and his wife's death was merely caused by his carelessness. Every night, he had been haunted by his guilt because he had failed to protect Grace. Madame Boswell said that she indeed sensed a strong curse from that sapphire stone. But since Thomas had gotten rid of that sapphire stone, Madame Boswell said that Thomas would be blessed all over again. At the same time, Arthur and John went to check the main battle tanks in the factory. They had been assigned with this task by Thomas before Thomas left his mansion. After that, Arthur and John executed their mission to catch Shangretta and his wife at the harbor in Liverpool. Soon after they caught Shangretta and his wife, they released Shangretta's wife right away and told her to run away to New York soon. Then, they brought Shangretta to Thomas. Thomas had been suffered greatly that his anger and pain could be seen from his eyes. Because of that, he was really excited to kill Shangretta slowly with his own hands. Because Arthur didn't want Thomas to become more violent, he decided to shoot Shangretta right away to end his suffering. After that, Thomas asked Ada to find information about an informant called James. Thomas didn't want to waste his time, so he asked the police to catch and arrest James immediately. Apparently, James was a person who had leaked information about the robbery at a factory in Lancaster and Sparburg. He asked James to tell him the names of the people who were parts of organizations who had given him information. Those organizations include the Economic League, the Vigilance Committee, and the Odd Fellows. James warned Thomas that people who belonged to those organizations were extremely dangerous, but Thomas wasn't afraid of them because Peaky Blinders was also an extremely dangerous organization. At Arthur's house, Arthur received good news from his wife Linda Shelby. His wife told him that she was pregnant. Arthur was happy when he heard that news. Then, Linda asked Arthur to seriously leave his illegal businesses because she didn't want to end up like Grace. A few days later, Thomas attended an important meeting. Tatiana, Mr. Romanoff, Lady Isabella, the priest, and the others had been waiting for him in that meeting. Thomas brought the names of the informants which he had received from James. He gave those names to Lady Isabella. Thomas said that he planned to move all of the main battle tanks by using a train. Because the priest interrupted Thomas for many times, Thomas wrote a note and gave it to Lady Isabella. On that note, Thomas wrote that he had secrets. Before Thomas left that meeting, he told Tatiana that the priest was the person who had revealed the information about the robbery of the main battle tanks. That information was leaked to James and forwarded to the embassy of the Soviet Union. With the permission from Lady Isabella, Thomas planned to kill the priest. The next day, Thomas gathered all members of Peaky Blinders to talk about the robbery of the main battle tanks. The Duchess promised to reward them with £150,000, some jewelries, and sapphire stones for that robbery. Thomas planned to share those rewards with everyone who got involved in that robbery. He would also use the rest of the rewards to establish a legal business of Peaky Blinders. At the same time, Aunt Polly went to a church to make a confession. She asked God for forgiveness for murdering a policeman called Chester and the next murder of a priest that would be committed by Peaky Blinders. After Aunt Polly returned home, Linda asked Aunt Polly, Esme, and Lizzie to join a protest to defend labor rights for women with her. They marched in the streets with other female workers to demand justice. At the same time, Tatiana visited Thomas's house to ask Thomas to show her that the priest had really betrayed them. After Thomas showed her the proof, Tatiana left Thomas's house immediately. After that, Thomas told Arthur and John that the Duchess's family had a special room where they stored a treasure in their mansion. Thomas worried that the Duchess's family wouldn't pay them after they completed the mission of robbery, so he planned to steal the Duchess's family's jewelries for their payment if the Duchess's family didn't pay them. Apparently, the confession that Aunt Polly made a few days ago at the church was found out by the priest. Father Hughes had found out that Thomas was planning to kill him. The next day, Thomas executed his plan to kill Father Hughes. When he was following the priest to a toilet, suddenly he was attacked by someone from behind. Then, Thomas was brought by them to a place. In that place, Thomas was severely tortured until he became unconscious. He was also injected with a liquid and forced to apologize to the priest in front of the Duchess's family. If Thomas refused to apologize to the priest in front of the Duchess's family, then Father Hughes would hurt Thomas's family and son right away. After that, the severely injured Thomas was left by the priest in an empty street. Despite of his severe injury, he struggled to return home to finish his business regarding the robbery. Instead of getting help soon for his severe injury, he decided to finish his business by canceling the mission of robbery first because he wanted to protect his family and son. Then, he attended a meeting in the Duchess's family's mansion and apologized to the priest in front of everybody who attended that meeting. After that, he attended a meeting with special counselors from the embassy of the Soviet Union. He told them that there would be a robbery of the main battle tanks in one of the factories in Birmingham. He said that his informant revealed this information in purpose so there would be a war in the Great Britain and the diplomatic relations between the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union would be ended. He also said that the robbery in Birmingham would be the trigger. Thomas told him everything because he didn't want the Soviet Union to blow up the train that they would use to move the tanks. If the Soviet Union blew up the train, then his family would be in danger. After that, Thomas finally asked Ada to bring him to the hospital. Thomas had endured great pain all this time because apparently his skull had been fractured. There was also heavy bleeding inside of his body. Because of that, he couldn't see anything except the face of his late father. For 3 months, Thomas had received an intensive treatment from the doctors in the hospital. He would be released from the hospital when he had fully recovered. Michael came to the hospital to talk to Thomas. He told Thomas that he had been knowing Father Hughes for a long time. Apparently, Michael had a personal grudge against Father Hughes for what he did in the past, so he asked Thomas to allow him to kill Father Hughes with his own hands. Arthur and the others came to the factory of the main battle tanks. They prepared some firing needles and used them to damage the weapons inside of the main battle tanks. Not long after that, a representative of the Soviet Union came and made an agreement where he and his team wouldn't blow up the train that they would use to move the tanks. As soon as Thomas returned home, he told Johnny Dogs that he was assigned to build a tunnel near the mansion of the Duchess's family. That tunnel would connect them to the special room where the Duchess's family stored their treasure. Therefore, they could steal the Duchess's family's treasure by using that tunnel. Not long after that, Thomas received a guest in his house. That guest was Alfie Solomons. The leader of the Jewish gang came to meet Thomas to offer a partnership with Thomas. After that, Thomas allowed Arthur and the others to come to that room. Arthur was surprised and mad when he saw Alfie there because Alfie Solomons had put him in a prison back then. Alfie Solomons regretted what he did to Arthur, so he apologized to Arthur. He said that he did that merely because of business. The next day, Thomas, John, and Arthur began their mission by investigating the special room that the Duchess's family used to store their treasure. When they went inside of the mansion of the Duchess's family, they were greeted by Tatiana and Lady Isabella. The mansion of the Duchess's family was heavily guarded by several security guards. After that, Thomas and the others entered a room where the Duchess's family treasure was stored. When they came there, they saw Alfie Solomons in that room. Alfie was assigned by Thomas to pretend to be a gemologist. Then, Thomas and the others were allowed by the Duchess to pick some jewelries that they want as their payment. After Thomas and the others observed the jewelries carefully, they decided to pick some jewelries which were equivalent to 7,000 pounds. A few days later, Thomas gathered his subordinates and assigned them to dig the tunnel with Johnny Dogs. He gave directions to them before they began to dig the tunnel. Inside of Michael's drawer, Aunt Polly found a bullet with the name of Hughes was written on it. Because of this, Aunt Polly was angry at Thomas. She warned Thomas that she would destroy Peaky Blinders if Michael used his gun to kill Father Hughes. The next day, the Shelby family took a photo in front of the Grace Shelby Institute, which was just inaugurated. Thomas planned to use that institute as the residential home for orphans. Thomas guaranteed that all orphans who lived there wouldn't be forced into doing labor or doing harmful or negative work. Unexpectedly, Father Hughes attended that inaugural event. He came there to remind Thomas that there were only 24 hours left for Thomas to do what he ordered him to do. Thomas had been busy talking to the guests that he didn't realize that his son had been kidnapped. It was obvious that Father Hughes was the one who had kidnapped Charles and took him as a hostage. When everybody found out that Charles was gone, they panicked and tried to look for him, but they couldn't find Charles anywhere. At night, Father Hughes finally told Thomas that he was the one who had kidnapped Charles. He kidnapped Charles because he had found out about the agreement that Thomas made with the Soviet Union. Because of that, the priest told Thomas to blow up the train. The priest threatened to kill Charles if Thomas refused to do that. The priest also said that he knew that Thomas had been digging a tunnel to steal the treasure of the Duchess's family. He told Thomas to give that treasure to him because he wanted to use it to establish his business. The priest said that he would return Charles to Thomas after Thomas had done everything he asked him to do. Thomas couldn't believe that Father Hughes found out about all of his plans. As long as he remembered, nobody knew about those plans except him and his family. Because of this, he was angry and accusing his family of betraying him. Thomas's state of mind was unstable that he failed to think clearly. He even came to meet Alfie Solomons and accused him of betraying him. Thomas and Alfie finally got into a fight. Suddenly Michael came to that place and killed Alfie Solomons' bodyguard. Fortunately, Michael managed to calm Thomas down. He told him that they needed to focus on the tasks that had been assigned by Father Hughes. After that, Thomas went straightly to the location of the tunnel construction. He was determined to finish digging that tunnel before midnight. He went inside of the tunnel and helped his subordinates to dig that tunnel. While they were digging that tunnel, suddenly a leakage occurred inside of that tunnel. Because it had a big risk, Thomas decided to blow up that tunnel by using a bomb. At the same time, Michael found Father Hughes. He was ready to kill him. In another place, Arthur was also ready to blow up the train. He decided to wait until 5 a.m. and planned to blow up the train after that if he didn't receive information that Charles was safe. At the same time, Thomas managed to steal the treasure of the Duchess's family, Michael managed to kill Father Hughes and save Charles, and Arthur managed to blow up the train. The next day, Thomas brought the Duchess's family's treasure that he had stolen to Tatiana. Apparently, Tatiana and Thomas had been working together secretly. Tatiana brought a person who would buy all of her family's jewelries with her. After Thomas received his money, he said goodbye to Tatiana. After that, Tatiana killed the person who had bought her family's jewelries right away. She did that so she could have his family's jewelries back, meanwhile Thomas could keep his money. After that, Thomas gathered his family to pay them because they had contributed to make their mission become successful. Each of them was paid well. Arthur and John planned to use the money that they received to start a new life. But when they were about to say goodbye to Thomas, Thomas told them that the police had issued an arrest warrant to arrest Arthur, John, Aunt Polly, and Michael. Not long after that, the policemen arrived and arrested Arthur and the others. Last time, Arthur, John, Aunt Polly, and Michael were caught and arrested by the police. This day at the police station, all of them were going to face a capital punishment for the crimes they had committed. But when they were about to be executed, the police suddenly canceled their capital punishment. Apparently, before the execution began, Michael had sent a letter to the Supreme Court judge. In that letter, Michael wrote that his family had been framed. He also added that if his family was still going to be executed, then the king would be dragged into this problem. After the Supreme Court judge read that, he ordered his subordinates to release the Shelby family. 1 year later, Thomas Shelby visited a hotel and met Lizzie there. Lizzie made a report about the company and gave Thomas a list of activities that would be done by Thomas. It had been a year since Thomas saw Arthur, John, and Aunt Polly because they had decided to live their new peaceful life. Thomas didn't mind about his family's decision. He couldn't force them to stay and keep doing the business. In the base of Peaky Blinders, Michael was still doing his job as Thomas's subordinate. He reported about some problems in the Peaky Blinders factory to Thomas. Those problems were caused by the labor leader called Jesse Eden. After that, Thomas asked Michael about Aunt Polly's condition. Michael said that his mother's condition was still the same. For this past 1 year, Aunt Polly often had hallucinations. She was often haunted by her daughter and the people whom she had murdered. Michael also said that Aunt Polly refused to see Thomas because she was still mad at him. At the same time, Ada Shelby was visiting the residence of John Shelby. She had returned from Peaky Blinders' business trip in the USA. At the office, Jesse Eden came to Thomas's room to talk to Thomas. As the representative of the female workers, she complained about the injustices that were being faced by the female workers at the Peaky Blinders factory. She urged Thomas to give proper salaries to all female workers there. Thomas said that he would be glad to give proper salaries to all female workers there, but if he did that, then there must be a decrease in the salaries of the male workers. Jessie was angry when she heard that. She thought that Thomas tried to pit the workers against each other. As soon as Thomas arrived at home, Mary gave some letters that she had received to Thomas. Thomas checked those letters. He was surprised when he saw that one of those letters was from Luca Shangretta. Luca Shangretta was the eldest son of Mr. Shangretta who had been murdered by Arthur. Thomas realized that the letter was a threatening letter from Luca. Luca was going to take revenge on the Shelby family. As Thomas had expected, the same threatening letters were also received by Aunt Polly, Arthur and his family, and John and his family. Apparently, Luca had become a leader of a gang. Because of that, he could easily find any detailed information about the Shelby family. After Ada Shelby visited John's residence, she visited the residence of Arthur Shelby. She found out that Arthur was running a farm business with his wife Linda and his son Billy. In the middle of her visit, suddenly Arthur received a telephone call from John. John talked about the letter he had received from Luca Shangretta. Arthur panicked when he heard that. He borrowed a gun from Ada so he could use it in case something bad happened. At the harbor in Liverpool, several mysterious men had just arrived from New York. Those mysterious men were Luca Shangretta and his subordinates. After Ada Shelby visited Arthur's residence, she visited the residence of Thomas Shelby. In Thomas's residence, Ada and Thomas talked about the letters they had received from Luca Shangretta. Just like Ada, Thomas also worried about the safety of their family. Based on the report they had received from Moss, they found out that Luca brought around 10 assassins with him. Those assassins would help him in his mission. Because of that, Thomas planned to ask all members of his family to gather in Birmingham so they could protect each other there. He thought that it would be easy for Luca to attack them if they lived separately like that. After that, he gave a gun to Ada so she could use it to protect herself. When Ada had left Thomas's residence, Mary came to Thomas's room to ask about when the dinner would be held. Since Mary kept mentioning about the new chef in his residence, Thomas began to get curious. Apparently, the new chef in Thomas's residence came from Italy. Thomas felt that there was something suspicious about that. Then, he found out that the assistant of that new chef was Sabini's subordinate. After that, Thomas told the chief cook to call his assistant. When the chief cook's assistant was entering the room, Thomas attacked and stabbed him immediately. Thomas spared the chief cook's life intentionally so the chief cook could send a message to Sabini. The next day, Thomas ordered Michael to pick up John and Esme. Thomas wanted to gather all members of his family in Birmingham soon to keep them safe. Unfortunately, Esme refused to go with Michael. While they were busy arguing, suddenly Luca's subordinates came and shot Arthur and Michael for several times. Because of that attack, John Shelby finally died. Meanwhile, Michael was in critical condition. The Shelby family was furious and greatly saddened by the death of John Shelby. Because of John's death, Esme finally decided to leave the Shelby family. She planned to take her children with her and return to the Lee family. Arthur was disappointed with himself because he failed to protect his brother. Despite Thomas was also greatly affected by the death of John, he gathered the rest of his family in a room to encourage them. He hoped that his family agreed to get together again because he didn't want to lose another member of his family. Thomas said that he had ordered a gangster called Abraham Gold to protect his family. He had also tightened the security by arming each of his gang's member with a gun to protect the Shelby family. The next day, the Shelby family gathered in a place to burn John's body. When John's funeral was being held, two Lucas subordinates were watching that funeral from afar. They prepared themselves to shoot the Shelby family. But suddenly, Abraham and his subordinates came and killed Lucas' subordinates before they managed to kill the Shelby family. Aunt Polly was disappointed with Thomas when she saw that. She didn't believe that Thomas used John's funeral to trap Lucas' subordinates. Thomas didn't try to defend his action. He just said that he was willing to do anything to stop Lucas' attack. After that, Aunt Polly went to hospital to visit Michael. Fortunately, Michael managed to survive. He wasn't in critical condition anymore. Aunt Polly asked Michael to move to Australia with her soon so they could have a peaceful life. But Michael refused her mother's offer and asked her to stay there to support Thomas. Despite everything that had happened, Michael thought that Thomas really needed them, especially in this kind of situation. If everything had gone back to normal, Michael promised to come with her mother to anywhere she asked him. After that, Aunt Polly went to see Thomas. She warned Thomas to be careful with everyone around them, including Abraham. At the factory, Abraham asked Thomas to hire his son Boney to become a member of Peaky Blinders. Before Thomas agreed to hire Boney, he asked Boney to fight a heavyweight boxer from Peaky Blinders. At the beginning of the fight, it seemed like Boney was weaker than his opponent because his opponent had a bigger body. But surprisingly, despite his physical appearance, Boney turned out to be a talented boxer. He finally managed to defeat his opponent, who was a heavyweight boxer. Thomas and Arthur realized that Boney had an exceptional talent as a boxer. They promised to promote Boney so he could join big boxing championships. At night, Moss asked Linda to tell Thomas about something. He said that he received information that the intelligence service in London had been investigating and looking for several people. Ada Shelby was the person who they were looking for the most because she was accused of bringing on a revolution in Birmingham. When Thomas arrived at the office, suddenly someone came to his room. Surprisingly, that person was Luca Shangretta. Thomas didn't know how Luca could get into the Peaky Blinders factory easily. He tried to stay calm and took a gun from his coat secretly. Luca seemed calm and unbothered even though Thomas was pointing a gun at him. Apparently, Thomas's gun had been unloaded by Luca's subordinate. Luca said that he was going to kill all members of the Shelby family one by one, and Thomas would be the last member of the Shelby family that he would kill. Luca thought that there was nothing more painful in this world than seeing people whom they loved and cared for were getting killed one by one. At the hospital, Michael's foster mother came to visit Michael. As soon as she heard about what happened to Michael, she went to hospital to see Michael right away. She brought Michael's favorite fruits with her. After that, the Shelby family came to the hospital to visit Michael. They also gathered there to have an important meeting. They delayed their meeting for a few minutes because Arthur hadn't come yet. Unluckily, Arthur still didn't come even after they had waited for a while. Apparently, Arthur didn't come to that meeting because of Linda. Linda seduced Arthur purposely so Arthur wouldn't go to that meeting. Thomas finally began the meeting without Arthur. The Shelby family talked about some technical issues related to their family's business. They decided to replace Michael's position for a while and welcome Aunt Polly for her return to the Shelby family's business. They also talked about Luca Shangretta. Thomas planned to distribute the picture of the Shangretta family in the entire town. He wanted to give a reward to anyone who managed to find Luca Shangretta. Arthur was asked by one of his employees to check the paint factory. As soon as he arrived there, he forced some people who had caused problems there to go away. When Arthur was about to leave that place, he was suddenly attacked by two Luca's subordinates. Fortunately, Luca could avoid their attack. He finally managed to attack them back and kill those two Luca's subordinates. Because of this attack, Arthur Shelby had to break his promise to God again after he had promised not to kill anyone ever again. At the factory, Thomas finally met Arthur. Arthur told Thomas that he had just killed two Luca's subordinates there. Arthur was really affected by the murder he had just committed. He became angry and left that place instantly. At night, Thomas called and investigated the factory manager called Devlin. Thomas suspected that Devlin had worked together with Luca to send Luca's subordinates to kill Arthur in the Peaky Blinders factory. Devlin denied that accusation right away. He suspected the two Italians who joined the Communist Party instead. After Thomas heard that, he went to Jesse's house immediately because Jesse was a member of the Communist Party. Thomas showed a picture of the Shangretta family to Jesse. From that picture, he told Jesse to show him the person whom she had met in a recent meeting of the Communist Party. Jesse said that she didn't know anything about that. Aunt Polly met Luca Shangretta in a pub. Surprisingly, Aunt Polly offered a deal with Luca. She said that Luca was allowed to kill Thomas but Luca should leave Arthur. Michael, and the rest of the Shelby family alone. The next day, Thomas had a guest in his room. That guest was a woman called Rose. Apparently, Rose was a mother of a son who died because he was murdered by Arthur. She came there to ask Arthur to come to her house as a symbol of apology. Since Thomas didn't want the same thing that happened to John to happen to Arthur, he asked his subordinates to guard Arthur during his journey, especially in this kind of situation where the Shangretta's gang was still targeting them. As Thomas had expected, Rose had conspired with some Italians against Arthur. Luckily, Thomas and his subordinates managed to stop their attack. But turned out, that attack was merely a bait for Thomas and his gang. Luca Shangretta and his subordinates went to the hospital to see Michael, but Luca didn't come to the hospital to kill Michael. He came there to tell Michael that he had made an agreement with Aunt Polly. Not long after that, Thomas, Arthur, and their subordinates finally arrived at the hospital. They saw Michael's bodyguard lying dead on the floor after he was killed by the Shangretta's gang. After Thomas saw that, he came to Michael's room right away to check if Michael was all right or not. Michael decided not to tell Thomas about the agreement between Luca Shangretta and his mother. Thomas didn't want to lose track of Luca, so he called Abraham right away to tell him to stop Luca. Abraham's subordinates managed to find and stop the Shangretta's gang in a bridge. They killed some Luca's subordinates there, but unfortunately Luca managed to run away. At the hospital, Michael confronted his mother about the agreement that she made with Luca Shangretta. Michael disagreed with that agreement even though he knew that his mother made that agreement to protect him. After the attack on the bridge, Luca called Aunt Polly and urged her to bring Thomas to him soon. He said that if Thomas wasn't brought to him soon, then Michael would be in danger. After Aunt Polly heard that, she went to the Shelby family's office right away to check Thomas's activity schedule. Lizzie asked Aunt Polly to tell her fortune while she was trying to find Thomas's planner book for her. After Aunt Polly checked Thomas's schedule, she found out that Thomas was free on next Friday. Then, Aunt Polly told Lizzie about the result of her fortune-telling. She said that Lizzie was pregnant with Thomas's baby. At the same time, Thomas was checking on Bonnie in the boxing ring. Bonnie's trainer told Thomas that Bonnie was ready to join a middleweight boxing championship. When Thomas returned to the factory, Thomas received information about a labor strike regarding the revolution in Birmingham. After Thomas received that information, he called Ada and asked her to solve that problem immediately. Then, Ada came to see the leader of the mass, Jesse Eden. She invited Jesse to a pub to have a drink. The pub they were visiting was actually a pub for men, but when Jesse and Ada entered that pub, the pub's owner and the waiters there couldn't stop them because Ada was a member of the Shelby family. They were afraid that their pub would be destroyed by the Shelby family if they had a problem with their member. In that pub, Ada gave Jesse a special invitation from Thomas. Ada said that Thomas wanted to discuss about the demands from the workers with Jesse, especially the demand about the equal rights between the female workers and the male workers at their factory. The next day, Alfie Solomons and his subordinate arrived in Birmingham. Alfie brought his favorite boxer called Goliath with them. Apparently, Thomas wanted to see Bonnie's skill by putting him in a boxing fight against Goliath. On Friday, Thomas visited Michael at the hospital. As soon as he came out of the hospital, the Shangretta's gang was following him secretly with a car. They had prepared themselves with weapons and ammunition to kill Thomas. Thomas sensed that the Shangretta's gang was following him, so he stopped his car in a residential area. Apparently, Thomas had also prepared some weapons and ammunition there to attack the Shangretta's gang. He managed to kill a member of the Shangretta's gang during that attack. After that, Thomas tried to run away from Shangretta and his gang. Luca and his subordinates were chasing Thomas right away. They entered a building in that residential area to catch Thomas. Thomas and the Shangretta's gang were attacking each other. Thomas managed to kill Luca's subordinates one by one until there was only Luca and one his subordinate left. Right before the assassination took place, suddenly the policeman arrived and stopped them. At Thomas's residence, Thomas and Aunt Polly told the Shelby family that they had planned the attack that happened that day. Apparently, Thomas was the one who ordered Aunt Polly to approach Luca so they could prepare everything to defeat the Shangretta's gang. Even though Thomas failed to kill Luca that day, he still managed to kill 3 Lucas's subordinates. After everybody had left, Lizzie came to Thomas's room and told Thomas that she was pregnant with his baby. Thomas was speechless when he heard about that. But then he said that he promised to protect Lizzie and their baby. He also promised to prepare a bright future for their baby. Luca Shangretta came to see Alfie Solomons in London. He wanted to offer a deal with Alfie Solomons. Luca asked Alfie to bring Luca's subordinates with him when he watched the boxing fight between Goliath and Bonnie. Luca wanted to use that moment to take revenge on Thomas. Obviously, Alfie wouldn't accept that offer without a price. He asked Luca to pay him with an amount of money and help him to smuggle some drinks to New York every month. In Birmingham, suddenly some soldiers came and arrested Ada Shelby. They arrested Ada Shelby because they had been suspecting that Ada was one of the masterminds behind the revolution. They suspected her even more when they saw her having a drink with Jesse Eden in a pub a few days ago. Ada tried to explain about her real situation when she heard that. She said that she had left the Communist Party after the death of Freddie Thorne. She also said that the reason she was having a drink with Jesse was only because of business. After Colonel Ben Younger heard Ada's explanation, he finally released Ada. At night, Ada told everything about what she experienced that day to Thomas. Apparently, Colonel Ben Younger was sent by the king through Churchill to help Thomas. Thomas was asked by the king to investigate the officials of the Communist Party through Jesse Eden. Because of that, Thomas was trying to use his charisma and looked to lure Jesse Eden. He invited Jesse to have a dinner with him in the hope that Jesse would tell him about the officials of the Communist Party who had become the masterminds of the revolution in Birmingham. To lure Jesse, he said that he had fulfilled Jesse's demand about the equal rights between the male workers and the female workers at the factory. The day of the boxing fight between Bonnie and Goliath finally arrived. All members of the Peaky Blinders and the Jewish gang came to watch the boxing fight. Arthur also came and enjoyed that boxing fight. But suddenly he noticed two men who were standing near the boxing ring. He noticed that those two men weren't paying attention to the boxing fight. He thought that they were watching the situation instead. Because of his suspicion, Arthur followed one of those two men when he was leaving the crowd. In that boxing fight, Goliath led the game for a moment. Bonnie had difficulty to fight Goliath because Goliath's body was bigger and stockier than his body. In spite of that, Bonnie refused to give up easily. He was determined to defeat Goliath and win that competition. Arthur was walking carefully into a room. He had prepared a gun to protect himself. But suddenly, someone attacked him from behind and strangled his neck. When that person was going to kill Arthur, suddenly Thomas came to that room and shot that man to death. Unfortunately, it was too late because apparently Arthur had passed away. At the same time, Bonnie finally managed to turn things around. He managed to defeat Goliath and came out as a winner in that boxing competition. Sadly, the Shelby family was unable to cheer and celebrate Bonnie's win because they were shocked and saddened by the death of Arthur Shelby. After they investigated that place for a while, they finally managed to find one intruder. That intruder was getting tortured by the Shelby family immediately. His eyeballs were also gouged out by Finn Shelby. Since Thomas had been getting emotional, he stepped into the boxing ring and fired his gun. He told everybody to stay in their place because he wanted to investigate all of them. The next day, the Shelby family held a funeral to burn Arthur's body. In the middle of the funeral, suddenly Audrey Shangretta came and brought a white flag with her. She wanted to reconcile with the Shelby family. Audrey Shangretta asked Thomas to make an agreement with her to end all of these killings. She also asked the Shelby family to surrender all of their businesses to the Shangretta's gang. If Thomas refused her request, then Luca wouldn't stop killing the members of the Shelby family, because Thomas didn't want to lose another member of his family. Finally, he agreed to make that agreement. The next day, Luca Shangretta came to the Peaky Blinders factory with a happy face. He had prepared a letter of agreement which stated that Thomas Shelby had agreed to surrender all of the Shelby family's companies to Luca. Then, Luca told Thomas to sign that letter of agreement while kneeling down in front of him. Before Thomas signed that letter of agreement, he told Luca that in order to defeat something that was insanely strong, one needed to find a help from someone who was stronger than that thing. Thomas said that to Lucas because turned out he had paid Luca's subordinates to kill Luca and seize all businesses that were owned by Luca. Luca was furious when he found out about that. He was surprised when he saw Arthur in that place since he thought that Arthur had died. Apparently, Thomas had manipulated the death of Arthur and used it as a strategy to attack Luca Shangretta. Thomas decided to give the opportunity to kill Luca to Arthur so he could take revenge for the death of John Shelby. Then, with a single shot on the head, finally Luca Shangretta died at the hands of Arthur Shelby. After that, the Shelby family threw a party to celebrate their success in defeating the Shangretta's gang. In that party, Thomas said that the Shelby family managed to defeat and kill all of their enemies. It was the time for Thomas and the others to take a break from their work so they could take a rest and enjoy their life for a moment after those long wars. Before Thomas took a break from his work, he wanted to finish his business with Alfie Solomons first. He found out that Alfie had worked together with Luca to bring some intruders in a boxing fight between Goliath and Bonnie a few days ago. Because Thomas didn't want to waste his time anymore, he killed Alfie Solomons right away. Three months later, Thomas was spending his time by playing golf together with his brothers. Even though he was on holiday, he didn't feel happy, calmed, or relaxed. On the contrary, he was constantly occupied by anxiety and fear, especially when he heard a gunshot. He also had nightmares every night. Because of that, Thomas decided to get back to work. On his first day at work, he came to see Jessie to ask her about the officials of the Communist Party who had become the masterminds of the labor strike. Jessie finally told him that one of them was Casey Douglas. After Thomas received that information, he told the Secretary of State about it right away. Because of that information, Thomas received a reward related to his business. He also said that he wanted to destroy all kinds of revolutions, so he asked the Secretary of State to allow him to become a parliamentarian of the Labour Party in Birmingham. Surprisingly, Thomas received more votes than the votes that were received by other candidates in that election. Because of that, he finally became a new parliamentarian of the Labour Party in Birmingham. 2 years had passed after Thomas Shelby was elected as a parliamentarian. One day, Thomas received a telephone call from Arthur. Arthur said that he had just received a letter from the Angels of Retribution. That letter was written to the Peaky Blinders. In that letter, the Angels of Retribution said that they had never heard of the Peaky Blinders and they weren't afraid of them. Thomas was mad when he heard that, so he ordered Abraham and Isaiah to introduce the Peaky Blinders to the Angels of Retribution. On the same day, the Peaky Blinders received bad news. They had lost a lot of money after the stock exchange in Wall Street in the US had crashed. Because of that, it was likely that the businesses that were owned by the Shelby family in the US would collapse. Michael was the person who was responsible for all businesses that were owned by the Shelby family in the US. Because of that, he was asked to go back to Birmingham. In Birmingham, Abraham, Finn, and Isaiah were going to the Angels of Retribution headquarters to attack them. During that attack, Finn got shot in the arm. Luckily, Abraham broke through the wall right away so they could get inside of that room and kill their target. After that, Abraham removed the bullet from Finn's arm immediately. Ada came to the room and saw that. She was mad at Finn because Finn didn't listen to Thomas. The Shelby family had never wanted Finn to get involved in their dirty work. They wanted Finn to live a life which was free from any immorality and crime. At the same time, Arthur came to see Thomas to show him a newspaper about the crash of the stock exchange in Wall Street. Thomas was angry when he read about that news. He had been reminding Michael to withdraw their shares since a few weeks ago, but Michael insisted on holding their stocks there. Thomas was very disappointed with the Peaky Blinders. He thought that they had never listened to him. Then, Thomas invited all members of the Shelby family to a board meeting. For these past few years, Thomas had suffered from mental health conditions. He had difficulty in controlling his anger and often displayed aggressive behavior. Because of that, he had been taking a sedative, but each time he took his sedative, he always had hallucination where he saw his late wife Grace Shelby, the woman he loved the most in this world. The next day, the board meeting was being held by the Shelby family. As the chairman of the board, Arthur was explaining about the problem that their company faced. But as a chairman, it seemed like Arthur wasn't as competent as Thomas. He was confused and unable to make any decision about the problem they were dealing with. Because of that, Aunt Polly suggested Arthur to wait for Thomas. Linda didn't like what Aunt Polly said to Arthur. She asked Arthur to continue their meeting because it was Arthur who was the chairman of the board and not Thomas. Not long after that, Thomas finally came to the meeting. He brought good news about their company. Apparently, there was still a hope for the Shelby family to save their company. Thomas had predicted that this kind of problem might appear in the future, so he invested a large portion of the Shelby company funds in the stock exchange in the US before the stock exchange crashed. After that, Thomas and the rest of the Shelby family went to the Garrison pub. At that pub, Ada showed the bullet that had been removed from Finn's arm. Apparently, the man they had killed was a Chinese man who used to be a pimp. This Chinese man had relation with the Angels of Retribution. Thomas was paid £50,000 by a senior parliamentarian to kill that Chinese pimp. After Ada and Lizzie left the Garrison pub, Aunt Polly told Thomas and Arthur that Ada was pregnant with the baby of Colonel Ben Younger. After that, Thomas attended a meeting that was held by the Parliament. He made a speech at that meeting. A parliamentarian who attended that meeting called Oswald Mosley was interested in his speech. Then, Thomas came to the room of the senior parliamentarian to take his money. That senior parliamentarian only gave £20,000 to Thomas. He promised that he would pay the rest of the money later. Thomas couldn't accept that decision. He thought that the senior parliamentarian was underestimating him. He threatened to reveal all crimes that had been committed by that senior parliamentarian to the public if he still refused to pay him until the next Monday. He said that he had the evidences of those crimes which he got from the pimp. At the office, Thomas received a letter from the Secretary of State Churchill. He also had a visit from a journalist called Levitt. As a journalist who was interested with the life of Thomas Shelby, Levitt was fully aware of Thomas's reputation in Birmingham back then. He was surprised that a gangster like Thomas could become a parliamentarian. He tried to threaten Thomas with the information that he had about Thomas. Thomas wasn't afraid with Levitt's threat. Instead, he attacked Levitt back by saying that he knew that Levitt was a homosexual. It was easy for Thomas to find out about everything about people who had worked for him because he was a powerful mobster. After that offensive visit, of course Thomas wouldn't leave Levitt alone. He ordered Arthur and his subordinate to kill Levitt immediately. The next day, Thomas woke up from his sleep. He was surprised when he looked outside of the window. He took a rifle and got out of his house right away. Apparently, someone had put a cross in his house yard. There was a scarecrow which looked like him being crucified on that cross. There was also a letter that said, "Look down on earth and see the seeds you have sown" inside of that scarecrow's pocket. Turned out, the area where Thomas was standing on had been planted with explosive mines. It meant that he would get killed instantly once he stepped over those mines. Because of that, Thomas was walking very carefully. He didn't want to take a wrong step. But not long after that, Thomas attempted to give up. He almost detonated a mine because he was tired with those death threats which he always received in his life. But he changed his mind as soon as he heard Charles's voice. He saw his son Charles was running toward him. Thomas was afraid if Charles might be harmed by the explosives, so he was running as fast as he could to save Charles. He managed to pick Charles up on time and take him away from that place. After Thomas kept Charles in a safe place, he returned to the minefield and detonated all mines there immediately by opening fire on those mines. When Thomas returned to his house, he received a telephone call from Michael. Michael said that he was being captured by a group of people. That group was led by a woman called Captain Swing. Captain Swing told Thomas that Michael had revealed a secret about dividing the horse racetracks in England. Michael yelled that Captain Swing was lying to Thomas. Captain Swing tried to make a deal with Thomas, but Thomas asked her to send Michael home instead. Michael finally arrived in Birmingham. He brought his wife Gina Gray with him. Arthur and Aunt Polly had been waiting for him at the harbor. When Aunt Polly saw Michael, she attacked Michael with many questions about the Shelby family's business immediately. She didn't even say hello or pay attention to the woman whom Michael brought with him. At the same time, Thomas and Ada came to see Mosley. Apparently, Mosley was a member of the IRA. The IRA had a bad relationship with the Peaky Blinders. They planned to overthrow Thomas because they thought that Thomas had lost his power. After that, Thomas and the others met Michael and Gina at the Garrison pub. Michael was asked to tell the truth about the situation on the ship. Michael said that he heard some men from the IRA gossiping about Thomas on the ship. Those men said that Thomas started to lose his power. Michael found out that those men were the Billy Boys. Thomas said that he believed what Michael had said as long as Michael swore on the baby whom Gina was pregnant with. Michael was angry when he heard that. He thought that Thomas was disrespecting him. In the woods, Abe Rama and Bonnie went camping together. When Abe Rama was preparing their dinner, suddenly he was shot in the shoulder by a group of men called the Billy Boys. In front of Abe Rama, the Billy Boys tortured, killed, and crucified Bonnie on the cross. They did that because they wanted to send a message to Thomas. They asked Abe Rama to tell Thomas that the best fighter of the Peaky Blinders was not good enough to beat the Billy Boys. They also asked Abe Rama to tell Thomas to surrender 2 of his territories to them. If Thomas refused to do that, then Thomas would be the next victim who would be crucified by them on the cross. At home, Linda said that she was disappointed with Arthur. She was mad because the Peaky Blinders went back to their gambling business to cover their loss in the stock exchange. For these past few weeks, the businesses of the Peaky Blinders were not as good as they were before. Because of that, Thomas didn't even remember about the birthday of Ruby. Ruby was the daughter of Thomas and Lizzie. At night, Abe Rama, who had gone mad, came to Thomas's house. He brought a bruised and bloody Johnny Dogs with him. Abe Rama had abused Johnny Dogs because he thought that Johnny Dogs was the person who had betrayed him by revealing the location of the camp to the Billy Boys, which caused Bonnie to get killed. Thomas calmed Abe Rama down immediately. He believed that Johnny Dogs would never betray them. He promised Abe Rama that they were going to take revenge on the Billy Boys. The next day, Thomas asked Arthur and Michael to go to London with him to see a man called Jimmy McCavern. Michael initially refused and said that he needed to accompany his wife to visit an obstetrician, but Thomas said that he would ask Ada to take Gina to the obstetrician instead. Before they went to London, Thomas asked Aunt Polly to visit Abe Rama at the hospital. Thomas asked Aunt Polly to calm Abe Rama down and prevent that man from behaving recklessly. After that, Thomas, Arthur, and Michael had a meeting with Mosley. At that meeting, Thomas told Mosley about Jimmy McCavern. Jimmy was a gangster who had killed his own colleague. After Mosley heard that, he tried to provoke them by saying that he knew everything about the internal conflicts in the Peaky Blinders. He knew that Michael had failed with the stock exchange. He also knew that Arthur's wife had left Arthur. With those information, Mosley thought that he was better than the Peaky Blinders. He wanted to make a deal with Thomas. Before he left that room, he gave Thomas a letter. He invited Thomas to become the deputy leader in a new political party. When Abe Rama was visited by Aunt Polly at the hospital, he asked her to take him home immediately. It seemed like Abe Rama disagreed with Thomas. He wanted to take revenge on the Billy Boys with his own way. As soon as Abe Rama arrived at home, he asked his sister to get a force and some weapons ready because he planned to depart for Scotland at night. At night, Jessie Eden approached the drunken Thomas. She asked Thomas to become a speaker in a protest about revolutions. After that, Lizzie told Thomas that Linda was having a relationship with a widower. When Thomas found out about that, he called Arthur immediately to tell him about that. The next day, Arthur came to the address that was given by Thomas to find his wife Linda. He met a man in that place. When he asked that man about Linda, that man refused to tell him about anything. Arthur became furious because of that. He beat up that man to death. In Scotland, Abe Rama and his subordinates stopped the Billy Boys in the middle of the road. The Billy Boys got out of their car and complained about that roadblock. They were surprised when they saw Abe Rama there. Abe Rama and his group attacked the Billy Boys immediately and threw hot liquid asphalt at them. At the same time, Mosley met with Thomas again. While they were going hunting, Mosley told Thomas that he would leave the British Fascist political party one day before that party was formed. Then, Thomas asked the intelligence service to allow him to work together with Mosley as an informant. In Scotland, Arthur barged in on Abrama and forced him to go back to Birmingham. Jimmy McCavern and his gang, the Billy Boys, came to Abrama's house. They went inside of a hut to look for Abrama. Apparently, Abrama had left a bomb in that hut to welcome them. Jimmy was interested in Thomas Shelby after he saw that. He thought that Thomas was good enough to become his opponent. After that, Jimmy McCavern and Thomas Shelby finally met with each other. Both Jimmy and Thomas carried white flags as a symbol of truce. They did that because Thomas had made an agreement with Mosley, and Mosley was a colleague of Jimmy. At the same time, Arthur met with a young man called Billy. He asked him to manipulate the football match. The football match was one of Peaky Blinders' businesses. After Billy agreed to make a deal with him, Arthur left that place and went to the Garrison pub. At the Garrison pub, a Chinese man called Brilliant Chong came to see Thomas and Arthur. As expected, Chong came to see Thomas because he wanted to make a business deal with Thomas. To make sure that Thomas would agree to make a business deal with him, Chong had ordered one of his subordinates to threaten Finn with a gun. When Thomas found out about that, he told Chong to call on his subordinate to pull back first. Only after Chong had pulled back his subordinate that Thomas would be willing to talk about business with him. Then, Chong took a pack of uncut opium from his pocket and showed it to Thomas. Chong asked the Peaky Blinders to help him smuggle 7 tons of opium, which was equivalent to £1,190,000. He planned to keep those opium in London for a week before he sent them to San Francisco. Chong said that he would give £250,000 to the Peaky Blinders if the Peaky Blinders helped him. With those money, the Peaky Blinders could cover their loss in their business in the US. After Thomas discussed about Chang's offer with Arthur and Aunt Polly, he finally agreed to make a business deal with Chong. At the office, Thomas met with Abrama. Thomas told Abrama to be patient and not to attack Jimmy in the near future because they still had an agreement. In return for his patience, Thomas suggested Abrama to propose to the woman he loved, who was Polly Gray. In a few days, Thomas was going to hold a ballerina party in his house. He invited Mosley to that party. Mosley came to Thomas's room to talk to Thomas. He said that he knew that Thomas held that party for his late wife Grace because that party would be held on Grace's birthday. He also said that he actually got involved with Grace in the past. Thomas didn't like what Mosley just said, so he attacked him by mentioning about Mosley's dark past. Thomas said that he knew that Mosley got involved with his wife's younger sister and his wife's stepmother. He knew that Mosley got involved with numerous women back then, and Mosley didn't care if those women were his relatives or not, because of his immoral lifestyle. Thomas thought that Mosley was a dangerous brute. After the conversation with Mosley, Thomas had a hallucination where he saw Grace again in his room. Thomas heard Grace telling him to follow his heart. At night, Thomas met with Jimmy to do their business. He was awarded a check for £10,000 there, but that check must be signed by Mosley. The ballerina party in Thomas's house was finally being held. Many people from all walks of life came to that party, including Mosley. Mosley was greeted by Aunt Polly there. Aunt Polly said that she would give Mosley a special room and a woman who would accompany Mosley in that room. In his room, Thomas was worrying about Lizzie. He was afraid that the incident that happened to Grace in the past would happen again. Because of that, he asked Lizzie to be careful. He said that he had asked Johnny Dogs to watch over her. Then, Thomas met with Mosley in a room. Thomas showed Mosley the check that he got from Jimmy. That check must be signed by Mosley. The ballet performance finally started. Suddenly, Linda came to that party and aimed a gun to Arthur. She was furious with Arthur because Arthur had killed her best friend. Instead of trying to fight, Arthur completely surrendered himself to Linda. He was ready to die at the hands of his wife because he really loved her. But suddenly, Aunt Polly came and shot Linda before Linda managed to shoot Arthur. She only shot Linda in the arm because the purpose of her shooting was to protect Arthur. After that, they brought Linda to the dining room. Thomas removed the bullet from Linda's arm immediately. To induce her insensitivity to pain, they gave Linda a mix of alcohol and opium as anesthetic. They also used that homemade anesthetic to put Linda to sleep. After that, Mosley made a speech in front of the Shelby family and all the party guests. He told everybody there that he was going to form a new political party called the British Union of Fascists. He said that he formed that party because he and Thomas wanted to make a better change in the government and the public policies. Everybody seemed proud and happy with Mosley's idea. They were excited to give their support to the British Union of Fascists. After that, Mosley told Thomas that he was confident that they were going to take over of government soon. Mosley promised to give an authority in the northern region to Jimmy and an authority in the central region to Thomas, but he hadn't decided who was going to take control of the southern region. Thomas realized that it was not easy to defeat a strong opponent like Mosley. He couldn't take any action in the near future because Mosley had trapped him. Mosley had taken advantage of the offer that Thomas couldn't refuse. In another room, Linda finally woke up. Arthur approached her immediately and apologized to her. Arthur said that he was willing to do everything that Linda asked him in order to be forgiven by her. but unfortunately, Linda was very disappointed with Arthur. She refused to forgive him. The next day, Colonel Ben Younger came to Thomas's room to talk to Thomas. Apparently, Colonel Ben Younger had made an agreement with Thomas. He promised to help Thomas arrest Mosley and Jimmy by using the legal authority. Thomas showed Colonel Ben Younger a check that he got from Jimmy. He said that they could use that check as the criminal evidence. Colonel Ben Younger said that he had discussed about this problem with his senior, but apparently his senior didn't think that Mosley had committed any crime. To make the situation even worse, it was reported that Mosley had gained more followers after he made a speech in Thomas's ballerina party. Colonel Ben Younger also said that he had received a personal threat from an organization called the Section D. That personal threat was related to Mosley. In spite of those situations, Colonel Ben Younger said that he would still help Thomas. For the time being, he planned to use the check that Thomas got from Jimmy as the criminal evidence. As soon as Colonel Ben Younger got inside of his car, he opened and read the check that he had taken from Thomas's room. Not far from his car, there were some children who were playing a football together. When one of those children accidentally kicked the football into Colonel Ben Younger's car, something horrible happened. Colonel Ben Younger and one of those children died because of that horrific incident. Thomas regretted that he had involved Colonel Ben Younger in this mission. Then, Thomas told Ada about the death of Colonel Ben Younger. Ada was surprised when she heard about that. Even though she didn't really love Younger, she felt sad over Younger's death because Younger had been really kind to her. She thought that Younger didn't deserve to die in a horrific incident like that just because he was close to the Shelby family. At the same time, Arthur, Chong, and their team went inside of a ship to check the opium. Apparently, another gang had been waiting for them on that ship. They attacked Arthur and his team relentlessly. Many people got wounded and died because of that attack, including Chong. Arthur was mad because of that. He grabbed a rifle from his teammate and came out of his hiding place. Then, he started to shoot that gang brutally like a madman. Because of Arthur's brutality, the gang finally ran away from the ship. Arthur and his team managed to save 7 tons of opium on that ship. The next day, Thomas went to a mental asylum. He visited his former comrade in a French war called Barney. Barney used to be a very skilled sniper who had never missed his target, but when the war was over, Barney started to become insane. He was put in a jail after he killed his own colleague. Thomas took a pill of a mixed opium and cyanide from his mouth. He would give it to Barney if Barney wanted to take his own life, but Barney refused to take that pill because he still wanted to live. Thomas was glad when he heard that. He promised to release Barney from that place. Thomas planned to order Barney to kill someone. After that, Thomas met with Jimmy. Thomas told Jimmy about the attack from a gang called the Titanic on the ship a few days ago. Thomas also mentioned about the division of the territories that Mosley told him. He suggested to give an authority in the southern region to the Jewish gang leader Alfie Solomons. Not long after that, Arthur came to that place. He gave 10 sacks of opium to Jimmy. After Jimmy had gone from that place, Thomas told Arthur about his plan to release Barney. He planned to order Barney to shoot Mosley at long range. Meanwhile, he planned to order Abrama and Arthur to kill Jimmy. He wanted those murders to take place in a campaign rally that would be held by the British Union of Fascists. Mosley would make a speech in that campaign rally. At night, the Secretary of State Churchill met with Thomas. The Secretary of State Churchill found out that Thomas had joined Mosley's political party. He was aware that Thomas was working together with Mosley because Thomas wanted to spy on Mosley. He said that what Thomas was doing was really dangerous since Mosley was not an ordinary person. Mosley had a reputation as a dangerous brute. However, Thomas was not afraid of Mosley. He was willing to do everything to destroy Mosley and his followers. The Secretary of State Churchill admired Thomas for his courage and ambition. He said that he wished to meet with the Shelby family in the future. Because of the help of Billy, the Peaky Blinders managed to make a big profit from the football match. Finn told Arthur about their win, but Arthur didn't believe in Billy. A few days later, the Shelby family held a meeting. In that meeting, Thomas announced that Abrama and Aunt Polly would get married soon. He also mentioned about a number of important points that the Shelby family needed to know. The first point was about the Colonel Ben Younger who died in a bombing incident. The second point was about Michael's position in the Shelby Company. When Thomas mentioned about the second point, Michael got up from his chair and told everybody about his plan with his wife. He said that he planned to take charge of the opium business in the US. He was confident that he would make $20 million per year from that opium business. He arrogantly said that the profit he would make from the opium business in the US would cover the losses in other businesses that were managed by other members of the Shelby family. He promised that the Shelby family would live a luxurious and joyful life because of that business. Michael planned to overhaul the internal structure of the Shelby Company. He had even written a business proposal based on that plan. He gave the proposal to Thomas and said that all Thomas needed to do was just signing that proposal. Thomas didn't like Michael's rude and arrogant behavior, so he threw the business proposal that Michael gave him into the fireplace. After what Thomas had done and sacrificed to the Shelby Company, Michael still had the audacity to overhaul the internal structure of the Shelby Company and even write a business proposal based on it. Because of that, the tension between Thomas and Michael became worse. Aunt Polly even slapped Michael's face for Michael's rude and arrogant behavior. After Michael left the meeting, Thomas mentioned about the third point. The third point was about Barney, who would be ordered to shoot Mosley when he made a speech on the stage. When other members of the Shelby family heard that, they immediately doubted Thomas's plan to kill Mosley. They couldn't believe that Thomas ordered a mentally ill person to kill Mosley who would stand on the same stage as him. But Thomas believed that Barney could execute his mission well. He believed that Barney was still a very skilled sniper like he was before. At night, Charlie was ordered to bring the opium to a Chinese man. The Chinese man would give 300,000 pounds to him as a return. Thomas always gave choices to all members of the Peaky Blinders. He allowed his members to do their task or not do it, but he promised to reward those who executed this mission well with 30,000 pounds. The next day, Thomas and Arthur went to the Garrison pub. They interrogated a bartender called Mickey there. Thomas found out that the Titanic gang managed to attack them on the ship because someone had revealed their information to the Titanic. Thomas also found out about the person who planted a bomb in Colonel Ben Younger's car. That person was called Patty Rose. Mickey didn't say anything when Thomas told him about that. Apparently, he was the person who had sold information about the opium in Colonel Ben Younger to Patty Rose and the Titanic gang. Because of that, Thomas shot Mickey on the face instantly. Mickey died because of that shooting. After that, Thomas went to Alfie Solomon's house. Turned out, Alfie Solomons was still alive. He didn't die when Thomas shot him 2 years ago, but he was severely injured because of that shooting. Thomas came to Alfie's house because he wanted to make a deal with Alfie. Thomas asked Alfie to kill Mosley and promised to give 25,000 pounds to him as a return. Aunt Polly had been waiting for Thomas at the office. Aunt Polly said that she disagreed with all Thomas's plans, so she decided to leave the Shelby company. Thomas began to feel anxious. He tried to call his relatives, but nobody answered his telephone calls. The next day, Thomas accompanied Barney in his training. He wanted Barney to prepare himself well for his mission to kill Mosley in the campaign rally. As Thomas expected, Barney was still a very skilled sniper like he was before. The campaign rally was finally held. Mosley came to that campaign rally. He was heavily guarded by the Billy Boys. Not long after that, Thomas, Arthur, and the Peaky Blinders also came to that campaign rally. Finn said goodbye to Billy. Before he left that place, he told Billy that the Peaky Blinders was going to kill Mosley that night. After Finn left that place, Billy picked a telephone to call someone. Jessie Eden also came to that campaign rally for an anti-fascist protest. Because of her anti-fascist protest, Jessie was caught and arrested by some policemen, but luckily, Thomas saw her and released her immediately. When everybody was busy with the campaign rally, Arthur took Barney to the location that they had chosen to shoot Mosley. Arthur told Barney to get ready because he was going to shoot Mosley soon. He said that Barney needed to count to 10 after he saw Thomas took a watch from his pocket. After that, Barney had to shoot a man who stood right beside Thomas on the stage. Before Mosley went to the stage, Jimmy approached him in a room. Jimmy told Mosley that he saw the Jewish gang and the Peaky Blinders in that place. He suspected that they were plotting something against them, but Mosley dismissed Jimmy's suspicion right away. It was finally the time for Mosley to give a speech on the stage. His speech was broadcasted live on all radio stations in England, so everybody in England could listen to his speech. In the beginning of the speech, Mosley talked about the Secretary of State Churchill. He thought that he and Churchill had different idealism. During that speech, Thomas gave a sign to Barney by taking a watch from his pocket. When Barney almost counted to 10, suddenly he got shot from behind and died instantly. Apparently, Abrama had also gotten killed before he managed to kill Jimmy. Arthur was going to be the next victim, but he managed to fight the murderer and save himself. Then, Thomas, Arthur, and Jessie gathered in a room. Thomas got angry and frustrated because someone had revealed their plan to their enemy. When Thomas returned home, he had a hallucination where he saw Grace again. He heard Grace telling him that it was over and it was the time for Thomas to go with her. Thomas was on the verge of taking his own life, but he failed to shoot his head because his gun was empty. Apparently, Arthur had taken the bullets out. Lizzie was disappointed with Thomas when she saw what Thomas attempted to do. She called Thomas a coward for trying to take his own life. She thought that Thomas didn't care about his family. When Thomas returned to his house, he received a telephone call from a woman. That woman said that she had sent 3 corpses of people who died in the campaign rally. Those 3 people were Barney, Abrama, and Polly Gray. The Shelby family was greatly saddened by the death of Polly Gray. Michael swore to take revenge for the death of his mother, but not on the murder of his mother. Instead, he swore to take revenge on Thomas Shelby. He thought that his mother died because of Thomas's big ambition. For years later, Thomas visited a hotel in Miquelon Island in France. He told a receptionist there that he had booked a meeting room for an important meeting that he was going to hold. The receptionist told him to wait. While Thomas was waiting, he just ordered a glass of water. Apparently, for these past 4 years, Thomas had stopped drinking alcohol. Not long after that, a French man called Jean came to that place and approached Thomas. He mocked Thomas because Thomas was only drinking water. Thomas introduced himself to Jean by giving his name card to him, but Jean burnt Thomas's name card right away. Jean said that Thomas was the person who was responsible for making Jean and his group lose their jobs. Gene kept bothering and harassing Thomas that Thomas finally lost his temper. Everybody was surprised when they saw Thomas taking a gun from his pocket. Thomas wasn't afraid to kill anybody who dared to disrespect the Peaky Blinders. After that, Thomas went to the meeting room that he had booked. He met with Michael and his gang in that room. Since Polly Gray died, Thomas and Michael had never seen or talked to each other. However, they both managed to kill everyone who was responsible for the death of Polly Gray. Thomas arranged a meeting with Michael because he wanted to make a deal to Michael. He planned to take advantage of the men who had lost their jobs in Miquelon Island. He wanted to ask them to join his uncut opium business. Those opium would be shipped from Miquelon Island to Boston in the US. Michael and his gang didn't accept Thomas's offer immediately. They said that they needed to give Thomas's business proposal to their leader who lived in the US called Jack Nelson first. Apparently, Jack Nelson was the uncle of Gina Gray. After that, Michael's gang poured and offered a glass of whiskey to Thomas. Thomas refused and said that he didn't drink alcohol anymore. Michael and his gang laughed at Thomas when they heard that. Thomas held back his anger because he didn't want to ruin their business relation. Then, he told Michael and his gang that there was an informant in their group. He said that the man had a bleeding heart tattoo with Maria written in red. Michael and his gang looked at each other in confusion when they heard that. They were surprised that Thomas managed to find out such information. They thought that Thomas had humiliated them. After Thomas left that meeting, he called a policeman at the harbor immediately. He told the policeman that Michael was going to bring opium with him on the ship. Because of the tip-off from Thomas, Michael was caught and taken into custody by the police as soon as he arrived in Boston. Gina went to the prison to tell Michael that her uncle was going to release him soon. After that, Gina returned to her house. Suddenly Thomas showed up in her house. Gina told Thomas that her uncle Jack Nelson had bought an American license for starting a whiskey distillery when Jack traveled to London with the President of the US. It meant that Jack was going to take control of all whiskey businesses in the US. Since Gina despised Thomas, Gina tried to hurt Thomas by saying that her uncle had rejected Thomas's business proposal. Thomas was unbothered by what Gina said. He tried to hurt Gina back by admitting that he was the one who put Michael in the prison. He said that he didn't mind if Jack rejected his business offer. If Jack rejected his business offer, Thomas would sell his opium to the Jews who lived in the East Boston. That East Boston Jews was Alfie Solomon's. If it went ahead, then all Jack's businesses in the US would be lose in the business competition. At night, Thomas received a telephone call from Lizzie. Lizzie told Thomas that their daughter Ruby had a high fever. But Lizzie said that Thomas didn't need to worry because she had called a doctor to check on Ruby. When Lizzie said that Ruby kept muttering Romany words, Thomas was suddenly surprised and mad. He told Lizzie to watch over Ruby. He said that he would come back home that night. Thomas was aware that muttering Romany words was a sign of bad luck. He was afraid if something terrible happened to his family. Before Thomas left for Birmingham, he went to the prison to visit Michael first. Based on the information that he got from the letter of the President of the US and Jack's mistress, Thomas found out that Michael was going to be kept in the prison for a little while longer. Thomas suggested Michael to accept his business offer if Michael wanted to be released from the prison soon. Thomas also said that Michael couldn't trust Gina completely because he found out that Gina, Jack's mistress, the President of the US, and the President's wife were on their way to Liverpool and they planned to leave Michael alone in the prison. The next day, Thomas finally arrived in his house. He was relieved when he saw Ruby was doing better. In spite of Ruby's good health, Thomas still took Ruby to the hospital so the doctor could check on his daughter once again. After the doctor checked on Ruby, he said that Ruby was in good health and there was nothing to be worried about. Lizzie hoped that what the doctor said could make Thomas relieved and Thomas could take a proper rest. But Thomas said that he didn't have time to take a rest. There were some important businesses that he needed to take care of first. Lizzie was tired with Thomas's businesses. She said that it was time for Thomas to take a break from work and go on vacation with his family. Because of Thomas's poor sleep quality, Thomas had a seizure and a hallucination. He kept being haunted by the time when he served in a war in France. Lizzie woke up because of Thomas. She tried to wake Thomas up from his nightmare. After Thomas woke up, Lizzie treated the wounds on Thomas's back. Thomas said that he was all right because he didn't want to make Lizzie worry. He said that his body felt fresh and good since he had stopped drinking alcohol. He promised that he and the Peaky Blinders would take a break from work after he had done his business deal. The next evening, Thomas made a speech in front of 100 people from the Labour Party. He tore a paper which had a writing that said silence on it to show everybody there that they refused to be silenced anymore. He promised to become their representative to bring their concerns to the parliamentarians. After Thomas finished making a speech, a woman called Laura McKee or Captain Swing showed up and approached him. She was the person who captured Michael on the ship before. As the representative of IRA, she came to that place to tell Thomas that her group was responsible for the death of Polly Gray. She attacked Thomas by saying that Thomas began to lose his power and the public thought the same about Thomas. After Thomas heard that, he took some letters from his pocket. He dismissed Laura's thought immediately by presenting her some secret letters from Jack Nelson and a secret letter from the President of the US. Laura was caught completely off guard by those letters. Unlike what she had thought, Thomas hadn't lost any power. Thomas said that Jack and his team would arrive in London in a few days. They came to London to buy a license to import alcohol. Besides that, Jack was also interested in finding information about the political ideology fascism. Because of that, Thomas wanted Laura to work together with him to help Jack Nelson. When Jack arrived in London, Thomas planned to organize a meeting between Jack Nelson and Oswald Mosley. After that, he would send Laura to offer Dublin to Jack. If Jack accepted that offer, Thomas would manage to ship their opium to Boston. Laura was unable to speak when she heard Thomas's plan, but she finally agreed to work together with Thomas. Since Polly Gray died, Ada Shelby was appointed to replace her position in the Shelby Company. Ada met with Thomas to tell him that Arthur had become addicted to opium. She was disappointed with Thomas. She said that she really needed Thomas during this chaotic situation, but Thomas was only thinking about his business and putting himself in danger. After that, Thomas visited Alfie Solomons in his hiding place. He wanted to make a business deal with Alfie. He planned to sell 5 tons of uncut opium which had been stored in a warehouse in Liverpool. Alfie accepted Thomas's business offer immediately. He asked how much Thomas wanted him to pay. Gina visited Michael in the prison. She wanted to say goodbye to Michael. She told Michael that her uncle was going to release him from the prison soon. She also said that her uncle had promised to help Michael to kill Thomas with his own hands. At night, Thomas and Lizzie attended a meeting which was held by the fascists. As Thomas had promised before, he was going to become the representative of the people to bring their concerns in that meeting. Not long after that, Arthur came to that meeting and made a scene there. Under the effect of the opium he had been consumed, he ranted and raved in front of Thomas and everybody there. Thomas tried to calm Arthur down by giving him a letter from Linda. In that letter, Linda said that she might forgive Arthur for what he had done. Thomas said that Arthur needed to change if he really wanted to get back together with Linda. In that meeting, Thomas met Mosley and his new girlfriend Lady Diana. After they introduced themselves to each other, Thomas, Lizzie, Mosley, and Lady Diana gathered in a room to talk about their business. After that, Thomas met with Jack Nelson, who had just arrived in London. Jack told Thomas that he planned to buy a license to import alcohol because the alcohol industry in the US was really promising. When Thomas heard that, he told Jack that he had a good relationship with the Secretary of State Churchill. He said that the Secretary of State Churchill would help Jack to have his license if Jack agreed to work together with him. But if Jack refused to make a business deal with him, then Thomas would sell his opium to the Jews. Jack was interested with what Thomas said. He said that he would think about Thomas's offer first before he made any decision. At home, Lizzie saw Ruby sitting quietly in front of the fireplace. She found out that Ruby had a high fever again, so she called a doctor to check on her immediately. She also tried to call the Parliament to talk to Thomas, but Thomas was in the middle of a meeting. Lizzie had tried to call Thomas for several times when Thomas returned to his room. When Thomas was about to enter the room, he saw another vision of his past when he was serving in a war in France. As soon as Thomas arrived at home, Lizzie told him that their daughter Ruby was coughing up blood. Thomas was shocked when he heard that. He took Ruby to the hospital immediately. At the hospital, Ruby was raised to the emergency room by the doctors and the nurses there. Thomas tried to go to that room to accompany his daughter, but they didn't allow him. The doctor said that Thomas was not allowed to be near Ruby because coughing up blood was a contagious disease. Thomas thought that Ruby's illness was not an ordinary illness. He suspected that the illness was a curse for him because of what he had done in the past. Because of that, he came to see the gypsies to ask for their help to save Ruby. Since Thomas had arranged a meeting with Mosley and Jack on that day, he asked Ada to become his representative in that meeting. Ada agreed to help him. She went to Lady Diana's house because the meeting would be held there soon. At the beginning, Lady Diana disrespected and underestimated Ada, but after they had a little conversation, she found out the reason why Thomas sent Ada to become his representative in that meeting. Ada turned out to be as sharp and brilliant as Thomas. Before the meeting took place, Ada had even done some research on people who were going to attend that meeting. At the same time, Thomas arrived in the residence of the Lee family. He came to that place because he wanted to meet with Esme. Esme was John's ex-wife and a gypsy. Thomas accused Esme of putting a curse on his daughter, but after he saw Esme's reaction to his accusation, he realized that Esme was not the person who had put a curse on his daughter. As Thomas had told her, Ada gave invitations to Mosley, Jack, and everyone who attended that meeting. Thomas was going to give a further explanation about their business in the next meeting. When Thomas was about to leave the residence of the Lee family, Esme approached and stopped him. She asked Thomas to go a place with her. She said that Thomas might find an answer about the curse that happened to Ruby in that place. After Ada attended the meeting in Lady Diana's house, she went to the office of the Shelby Company. She wanted to find out about Thomas's business. She went through Thomas's notebook and found out that Thomas was hiding a large amount of opium in a warehouse in Liverpool. After Ada found out about that, She ordered Isaiah to visit and check that warehouse immediately. Ada heard that a leader of the general trade union called Hayden had organized a plan to steal the opium, so she asked Isaiah to meet Hayden and teach him a lesson. She also asked Isaiah to take Arthur with him. She thought that there must be a member of the Shelby family to keep a watch out for the workers in this mission. It was not like Arthur was busy with anything though. He had been locked in a safe in that office because they were afraid that he harmed anyone under the effect of the opium that he had been consumed. Isaiah, Arthur, and Arthur's subordinates finally arrived at the warehouse in Liverpool. They saw many workers sitting around and playing cards together in that warehouse. Arthur approached and asked a group of workers about Hayden's whereabouts, but those workers ignored him. They had no idea that the people who were talking to them were the Peaky Blinders. Not long after that, Hayden came to that place. Arthur approached and confronted Hayden about the opium theft that he had committed. Hayden was not afraid of Arthur. Instead, he attacked Arthur by saying that Arthur had become addicted to opium. Isaiah was mad when he heard that. He beat up Hayden immediately. Arthur decided to ignore Hayden and leave that place. Thomas and Esme finally arrived in the mountains. They left their car there and continued their journey by using horses. They went to the top of the mountains and found a graveyard there. While they were walking, Esme reminded Thomas about the cursed sapphire stone that had killed Grace in the past. A few days after Grace died, Thomas gave that cursed sapphire stone to a wise old gypsy woman called Bethany Boswell. Bethany Boswell then gave that cursed sapphire stone to her younger sister called Evadne Barwell. Evadne made a necklace out of that cursed sapphire stone and gave it to her daughter. Not long after that, her daughter died because of a lung disease. She was only 7 years old when she died. After Thomas heard that story, he believed that Evadne was the person who had put a curse on his daughter. He was mad because all of this happened because of what he did in the past. Thomas planned to find the Barwell family to apologize to them and ask them to lift their curse, but Esme said that the Barwell family had moved far away and lived by the sea since a long time ago. Thomas asked Esme to help him to find the Barwell family. As a return, he promised to do everything that Esme asked him as long as his daughter could be saved. At night, Thomas returned to the hospital. As soon as Lizzie saw Thomas arriving there, she cried and told her husband that Ruby had passed away. Lizzie was very disappointed in Thomas. She regretted that Thomas was unable to stay in Ruby's side in the last moment of her life. In spite of that, right before Ruby breathed her last breath, Lizzie still told Ruby that Thomas really loved and cared for her. Thomas was shocked and speechless when he heard what Lizzie had just said. He was just standing there in the rain and crying over the death of his beloved daughter. The next day, Thomas and his family took Ruby's body to the funeral. This was inarguably a hard time for both Thomas and Lizzie. Thomas swore that he would take revenge on the Barwell family for the death of his daughter. Because of the help from Esme, Thomas finally found where the Barwell family lived. He came to the Barwell family's residence and killed Evadne and several soldiers immediately. After he took revenge on the Barwell family, he got back to his car and rewarded Esme with what she asked. Esme expressed her condolence for the death of Ruby. She said that she still had important information to share. Esme said that when Thomas lost one of his children, God sent him another child. Esme found out that Thomas got involved with a woman called Zelda in the past. Apparently, Zelda was pregnant with Thomas's child and gave birth to that child. That child had grown into a young man called Duke. This information was new for Thomas. He joined the military and fought in a war in France before he knew anything about Zelda and their child. Apparently, Zelda had died a few years ago. Duke lived by himself as a thief since then. After Thomas found out about that, he knew that he needed to make a decision. He needed to choose between acknowledging Duke as his child or pretending like he didn't know anything about this and keep abandoning Duke in the forest. At night, Jack Nelson, Laura, Mosley, and Lady Diana came to Thomas's residence to attend the scheduled meeting. During that meeting, they had discussion about the political ideology, fascism, and the business that they were going to do together. Each of them was going to have their own role in that business. Jack Nelson was going to be responsible for any correspondence they would make to the President of the US. Mosley was going to take an important role in the government in the UK. Laura was going to use his power and influence as the leading member of the IRA to persuade the members of the IRA to be sided with the fascists, and Thomas was going to take advantage of his good reputation. He planned to leave the political party and run as an independent candidate. After they agreed to make a business deal, Jack Nelson promised to provide the IRA with weapons and ammunition. He would ship those weapons from Germany to Boston. He also promised to help Thomas to import his merchandises. The next day, Thomas was typing all conversations that took place in the meeting last night with his typewriter. He planned to send those conversations to the Secretary of State Churchill. He believed that it could be seen as criminal evidence that would bring Jack and the others down. After that, Thomas received a telephone call from his subordinate. His subordinate told him that he saw Mosley coming out of Gina's apartment. Thomas used that information to blackmail Gina. He said that Jack Nelson would disown Gina if he found out that Gina had slept with Mosley. Gina was afraid with Thomas's threat. Thomas said that Gina had to do what he asked her to do or else he would reveal this information to Jack Nelson. Thomas asked Gina to accompany Mosley when Mosley had a meeting with a senior German government official in Berlin. He wanted to know about what Mosley and that senior government official were going to discuss and what decision that they were going to make in that meeting. The next morning, Thomas's personal physician named Dr. Halford came to Thomas's house. He visited Thomas because he wanted to tell Thomas about Thomas's X-ray result and diagnosis. He said that Thomas was not infected with the tuberculosis that Ruby had, but he revealed that Thomas had been diagnosed with tuberculoma that occurred in his brain. This explained why Thomas had been having headaches, seizures, and hallucinations all this time. Dr. Halford said that tuberculoma was not a contagious disease, but sadly, it couldn't be cured by any treatment. He predicted that Thomas had only 18 months to live. When Thomas heard that, he remembered about what Polly Gray said in his dream. Polly said that Michael and Thomas were going to fight each other and one of them was going to die. Thomas wanted to keep this information from his family. He planned to go to a quiet and faraway place to isolate himself until he died because of the illness, but before that, he intended to finish his last business first. After that, Thomas visited a store which was selling opium in Chinatown. He ordered the store owner to surrender all opium that he owned to him. He also told him not to sell or buy any opium in that area. He threatened to blow up that store with dynamite if the store owner still dared to sell opium in that area. After Thomas left that store, the wife of the store owner suspected that the dynamite that Thomas brought with him was a fake dynamite. But suddenly, Thomas did this in front of their store. Thomas Shelby was a man who always kept his word. That was why he was highly respected and respected by many people. After that, Thomas gathered the Shelby family in a room. He wanted to tell them about some important things. The first thing that he announced was the marriage of Finn and a woman called Mary. After that, he introduced Duke to his family. He said that Duke was his own son. Everybody was surprised when Duke was being introduced to them, especially Lizzie. Then, Thomas asked Arthur to watch over Duke and show and teach him about how the Peaky Blinders worked. At night, Arthur, Finn, Billy, and Duke met with a referee who refused their request to manipulate the football match. The referee said that he didn't want to cheat in the football game no matter how much the Peaky Blinders paid him. Arthur was angry because of that. He told the referee to call the police and report the Peaky Blinders to them. As Arthur had expected, the police refused to be sided with that referee because the Peaky Blinders had bribed them before the football match began. After that, Arthur ordered Billy to kill that referee immediately. Billy refused his order right away, but Arthur forced him into doing it. Duke observed them quietly. He was learning about how the Peaky Blinders worked. He thought that the Peaky Blinders worked in a very dirty and unfair way, so he decided to leave that room immediately. Billy got frustrated because he had killed a human being for the first time. He was trying to calm himself in a bathhouse. Suddenly, Jack Nelson came and approached him. He came there to force Billy to spy on the Peaky Blinders. He planned to kill Thomas Shelby with his own hands, and in order to do that, he needed Billy to help him. Billy finally agreed to work for Jack Nelson because he was afraid that Jack Nelson killed him. At the same time, Linda came to the Garrison pub. Arthur was surprised when he saw Linda there. He kneeled down in front of Linda immediately. He apologized for everything that he had done in the past. He genuinely asked Linda to help him to change into a better person. The next day, Charlie brought Duke to Thomas. He told Thomas that Duke had stolen a car and a fair amount of money from the Peaky Blinders. Thomas was disappointed with Duke when he heard that. He didn't mind if Duke stole from other people, but it would be a different story if Duke stole from him. Because of that, Thomas gave a sum of money to Duke. He offered him a choice. He told Duke to choose between kept working as a thief or start working in the horse stable that was owned by the Peaky Blinders. After Duke heard what his father said, he decided to keep working there. At home, Lizzie was curious with the medicine that had been consumed by Thomas. Thomas decided to keep his illness from his wife. He lied that the medicine that he consumed was only a painkiller. That night, Thomas and Lizzie were going to have a meeting with Jack Nelson. In that meeting, Thomas said that he was going to visit Canada soon because he wanted to take his payout. The money that he would receive was $5 million. Mosley and Lady Diana weren't invited by Thomas to that meeting, but suddenly they came to Thomas's house and joined Thomas, Lizzie, and Jack Nelson in that meeting. They said that they came there because they wanted to say goodbye to Jack Nelson. They knew that Jack was going to return to the US soon. While they were having conversation, suddenly Lady Diana talked about her relationship with Thomas. Lizzie was hurt and uncomfortable with what Lady Diana said, so she decided to leave that meeting immediately. After Lizzie left, Mosley said that Lizzie was not good enough to become Thomas's wife. Thomas was mad because Mosley and Lady Diana kept disrespecting his wife, so he got up from his chair and said that Lizzie was indeed not good enough to become a wife of a bad man like him who was surrounded by bad people like Mosley and Lady Diana. At the same time, Michael was finally released from the prison. Because he had been freed now, he intended to execute his plan to kill Thomas Shelby with his own hands soon. The next day, Lizzie bade her farewell to Thomas. She said that she couldn't bear the pain of being Thomas's wife anymore. Charles found out that Lizzie was going to leave Thomas and their residence. He asked Lizzie to take him with her, even though Lizzie was only his stepmother. He thought that Lizzie loved him more than his own father loved him. When Thomas heard that, he allowed Lizzie and Charles to leave. He said that he would prepare a new house for them to live. He didn't mind with Lizzie and Charles's decision. He had planned to destroy their mansion and go to a faraway place to isolate himself because he was going to die soon. Charlie took Duke to an armory that was owned by the Peaky Blinders and showed him around. Because Duke was a son of Thomas Shelby, he needed to prepare himself to become a gangster and the next leader of the Peaky Blinders. As the requirement to become a gangster, Charlie interviewed Duke with some questions. He asked Duke if Duke had killed someone before. Surprisingly, Duke said that he had killed a nurse who refused to treat his mother just because his mother was a gypsy woman. Thomas came to his room in the office. He was surprised when he saw Arthur waiting for him there. Apparently, Arthur had found and seen the picture of Thomas's X-ray result. He was getting emotional when he found out that Thomas was going to die soon. Thomas told Arthur that after he had done his last business, he would go to a quiet and faraway place to isolate himself. He planned to leave all his properties and money to the Shelby family. He asked Arthur to keep the information about Thomas's illness from anyone, especially the Shelby family, because he didn't want to make them worry. After that, Thomas gathered all members of the Peaky Blinders in the Garrison pub. In that meeting, Thomas told them that he was going to go to Canada to take the payout for their selling of opium. He planned to go to Canada alone because Johnny Dogs was going to accompany him in Canada. He asked the Peaky Blinders to empty his house while he was gone because he was going to destroy that house. Michael arrived in the Miquelon Island. He brought a mysterious black bag with him. He carried that bag very carefully because that bag contained a time bomb. Apparently, Michael planned to kill Thomas by using that bomb. He chose to use a bomb because he remembered that his mother said that Thomas Shelby couldn't get killed by bullets. At the same time, the members of the Peaky Blinders surrounded and attacked Billy in Thomas's house. Apparently, they had found out that Billy had betrayed Thomas and them. Only Finn who didn't know about that. Because Finn had no idea about what was happening, he refused to kill Billy. Duke was impatient with that situation, so he took over and killed Billy immediately.
You are no longer a member of this Shelby family.
In the same evening, Laura and her group were going to execute their plan to kill Arthur. After Laura and her group found out that Arthur was in the Garrison pub, they came to that pub immediately, but when they went inside of that pub, they didn't find Arthur there. They only saw Charlie. Apparently, Arthur and the Peaky Blinders had prepared themselves because they had predicted about that attack. Laura was surprised that the Peaky Blinders found out about their plan. She ordered her subordinates to attack Arthur right away. They managed to shoot Arthur in the wrist. Not long after that, Jeremiah came and leaked a poison gas in that place. Laura and her subordinates finally died because of that poison gas. Thomas went to the Miquelon Island to have a meeting with Michael. Michael asked Thomas to go to another place with him by using his car to check some opium. When they were about to get inside of that car, Michael said that he left his wallet in the pub. Not long after that, something like this happened. Michael came out of the pub. He was shocked when he found out that Thomas was still alive. Apparently, Thomas had found out that Michael was going to kill him with a time bomb in that place. He ordered Johnny Dogs to move that time bomb to Jack's subordinate's car. Thomas was disappointed and furious with Michael when he found out about that. Because of that, he decided to kill Michael right away.
Your lethal hand is always on our shoulders.
I've no limitations.
After that, Thomas got back to the pub. Alfie Solomons showed up there and said that he was willing to help Thomas in Thomas's next mission. When Thomas returned to Birmingham, he destroyed his house like he had planned before. Before Thomas went to a quiet and faraway place to isolate himself, he gathered his family in a place. In that family gathering, Thomas bade his farewell to his family. He said that it was the time for him to take a break from his work and everything that had occupied his mind all this time. He asked his family to take care of the Shelby company well. 1 month later, Thomas had a dream when he was sleeping alone in his place. In that dream, he saw his daughter Ruby running toward him. Ruby asked Thomas not to take his own life because she found out that Thomas was not dying. Thomas saw a picture of the wedding of Mosley and Lady Diana on a newspaper. In that picture, he saw Dr. Halford attending that wedding. Because of that, Thomas realized that Dr. Halford had been working together with Mosley to terrorize and put pressures on him all this time. Dr. Halford tried to manipulate Thomas psychologically and mislead him into taking his own life. It was easy for Thomas to kill Dr. Halford right away, but he decided not to kill him. It was clear that Thomas Shelby was going to return to the Peaky Blinders and get back what he deserved.